Hi guys, tonight we explore a land where mountains rise like ancient walls, deserts stretch endlessly beneath the stars, and cities have risen and fallen for thousands of years. A place where kings once ruled half the known world, where merchants crossed continents, carrying silk and spices, and where the echoes of ancient empires still whisper through the modern streets of Iran. Imagine standing quietly beneath a pale dawn sky somewhere on the Iranian plateau. The air is cool and still. In the distance, rugged mountains glow faintly with the first light of morning. The land before you looks calm, now almost timeless, yet beneath this quiet landscape lies a story that stretches back more than 2,500 years. It is a story of empire, faith, conquest, poetry, revolution, and survival. Tonight you slowly walk through that long history step by gentle step, watching how a civilization once known as Persia gradually became the country we now call Iran. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, feel free to leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what the local time is for you right now. Now dim the lights and imagine yourself standing at the beginning of a very long journey through time. You are standing in a region historians often describe as one of the great crossroads of civilization. The Iranian plateau sits between the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, the wide plains of Central Asia, and the trade routes that stretch toward India and China. A widely accepted historical fact is that this location made the region incredibly important for thousands of years. Caravans moved through these lands carrying goods, languages, religions, and ideas. Armies marched across the same roads, sometimes bringing destruction, sometimes bringing new forms of culture. The landscape itself seems built for history. To the west lie the Zagros Mountains, forming a natural barrier between Persia and Mesopotamia. To the north stretch the forest near the Caspian Sea. To the south lies the Persian Gulf, where ships have sailed for centuries carrying traders toward Arabia and beyond. As you look across this terrain, it becomes easier to understand why powerful kingdoms eventually emerged here. Long before the name Persia appeared in history books, different peoples lived across this plateau. Small farming communities, nomadic tribes, and early kingdoms developed their own traditions and beliefs. One lesser-known detail about this early period is that many of the peoples living here spoke languages belonging to what scholars call the Indo-Iranian family. These languages share distant connections with many European languages today. Words spoken on this plateau thousands of years ago are distant linguistic cousins to languages spoken across Europe and South Asia. This ancient connection is something that surprises many listeners who imagine early civilizations as completely isolated. Yet the Iranian plateau was rarely isolated. Travelers, traders, and migrants moved through it constantly. Some researchers even suggest that waves of migrating tribes gradually reshaped the region over many centuries, bringing new languages and traditions with them. Exactly how these movements happened remains uncertain. Archaeologists continue discussing whether these migrations occurred quickly, through sudden population shifts, or slowly through gradual cultural blending. As you walk quietly through this early landscape, you begin to sense the slow formation of something larger. Different tribes begin forming alliances. Small kingdoms begin appearing across valleys and plains. Among these groups were people known as the Persians. Their name likely came from a region in southern Iran called Pars, known in ancient sources as Persis. At first, this area was only one small kingdom among many others scattered across the plateau. No one living there at the time could have guessed that the name of this small region would eventually become known across the entire ancient world. But history often begins quietly. Picture yourself in a modest early Persian settlement. Mud brick houses stand beside fields of barley and wheat. Shepherds guide flocks of sheep across the hills. The smell of cooking fires drifts gently through the evening air. Life here is simple and tied closely to the rhythms of nature. Families rise with the sun, farmers tend crops. Traders occasionally arrive carrying metal tools, fabrics, or spices from distant lands. What makes this region particularly interesting is how many influences passed through it. From Mesopotamia came advanced systems of writing and administration. From Central Asia arrived new horse riding traditions. From distant lands came religious ideas that slowly blended with local beliefs. Many historians believe that one important spiritual tradition emerging in this region was Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest known monotheistic religions. It centered around the teachings of a figure named Zoroaster, who encouraged followers to live through good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Yet even here, scholars remain divided about the exact time Zoroaster lived. Some suggest he lived around 1000 BCE. Others argue he may have lived several centuries later. The uncertainty itself adds a quiet mystery to the early Persian world. As centuries pass, these small communities slowly grow more organized. Tribal leaders become kings. Fortified towns appear. Trade routes expand across deserts and mountains. You can almost hear the soft clatter of caravan bells in the distance. Camels and horses carry goods across long distances. Traders exchange copper, precious stones, woven cloth and spices. Stories travel alongside these goods. News from distant lands spreads slowly from village to village. Gradually the foundations of a powerful civilization begin forming, but something even larger is about to appear on the horizon of history. A leader will soon emerge who transforms this small Persian kingdom into one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. His name will be Cyrus, and under his rule the story of Persia will begin to stretch far beyond these quiet valleys and mountain villages. For now, though, the land remains calm. Night slowly settles across the plateau. The sky above fills with countless stars. Fires flicker gently outside homes, while families gather for evening meals. You stand quietly in this ancient landscape, knowing that the world-changing events of empire and conquest are still just over the horizon. The long story of Persia has only just begun. The first light of morning spreads slowly across the hills of ancient Pairs. Pale golden glow touches the stone ridges and narrow valleys of southern Persia. The air feels cool and quiet, as if the land itself is waiting. You begin walking along a dusty path that winds between small settlements and open grazing fields. Farmers are already awake. A shepherd guides his flock toward a hillside pasture. Smoke rises softly from cooking fires. Life here still feels modest and local. Yet somewhere in this quiet landscape a transformation is beginning that will soon reshape the entire ancient world. The Persians, at this time, are not yet masters of a vast empire. In fact, they live under the rule of another powerful people known as the Medes. The Median kingdom dominates much of the Iranian plateau, and the Persians exist as one of its subordinate groups. A widely accepted historical fact is that the Persian king who will soon change this situation forever is a man known to history as Cyrus the Great. You can imagine him as a young nobleman growing up among the Persians of Pers. The details of his early life remain partly hidden behind legend, but ancient stories describe him as a leader with unusual ambition and vision. Some traditions even tell a dramatic tale about his birth. According to later Greek accounts, the Median king Astyages once dreamed that his grandson would overthrow him. Fearing the prophecy, the king allegedly ordered the child to be killed. Yet the baby was secretly spared and raised in obscurity before eventually returning to claim his destiny. Historians often caution that this story may contain more myth than fact. Scholars still debate whether these dramatic details reflect real events or simply the kind of legendary storytelling that ancient writers loved to attach to powerful rulers. Even so, what happens next is not legend. Around the middle of the 6th century BCE, Cyrus leads a rebellion against the Median Empire. You can picture the tension building across the plateau. Tribal leaders quietly choose sides. Messengers travel between settlements carrying secret promises and alliances. Warriors sharpen weapons and prepare horses. Then the moment arrives. Cyrus and his supporters rise against Median authority. The conflict does not last long. Within a few years, Cyrus defeats the Median king and takes control of the entire kingdom. Instead of destroying the Median system, however, he does something surprisingly strategic. He absorbs it. The Persian leader keeps many Median officials in place and adopts parts of their administrative structure. In doing so, he creates the foundation for a new empire that blends different traditions rather than erasing them. This approach becomes one of Cyrus's most important political strengths. As you continue your journey through this moment in history, you begin to see why his reputation spread so widely across the ancient world. Cyrus does not stop with the Medes. He begins expanding outward. First, his armies move west toward Lydia, a wealthy kingdom in Anatolia, famous for its gold and advanced trade networks. The Lydian king Croesus is known across the ancient world for his immense wealth. One interesting historical detail is that Croesus reportedly consulted the Oracle of Delphi before attacking Persia. The oracle told him that if he crossed the river Halys, a great empire would fall. Croesus assumed the prophecy meant Persia. Instead, it was his own kingdom that collapsed. Cyrus defeats Lydia and captures its capital Sardis. With that victory, Persia gains control of major trade routes connecting the eastern Mediterranean to Asia. But Cyrus's most famous conquest soon follows. You now find yourself approaching the great city of Babylon. Babylon is one of the most powerful and legendary cities of the ancient world. Its towering walls, massive temples, and famous gardens dominate the Mesopotamian landscape. To conquer Babylon is to control the heart of ancient civilization. Yet when Cyrus approaches the city in 539 BCE, something remarkable happens. Instead of destroying Babylon, he enters it with relatively little resistance. Ancient records suggest that many Babylonians may have welcomed him as a liberator from the rule of their previous king. A famous artifact known today as the Cyrus cylinder describes how Cyrus allowed local traditions and religions to continue under Persian rule. Many historians consider this one of the earliest known declarations of religious tolerance by a major imperial ruler. You can almost feel the significance of that moment. The gates of Babylon open. Persian soldiers walk through the wide streets beneath towering walls. Priests continue their rituals. Merchants keep trading in crowded markets. Life goes on. But the political map of the ancient world has completely changed. The Persian Empire now stretches from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. It becomes one of the largest empires humanity has ever seen up to that point. Another intriguing detail about Cyrus's policies is his decision to allow displaced peoples to return to their homelands. One well-known example involves the Jewish population that had previously been exiled to Babylon. Under Cyrus, many were permitted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Some historians see this as a genuine act of tolerance. Others suggest it was also a clever political strategy designed to stabilize the empire by respecting local cultures. Researchers remain divided about Cyrus's true motivations. Was he guided primarily by ideals of fairness, or was he simply a brilliant strategist who understood that respecting traditions helped maintain peace across a diverse empire? The answer may be a mixture of both. As you look across the growing Persian world, the scale of Cyrus's achievement becomes clear. In just a few decades, a small kingdom from the hills of Pars has become the center of a vast imperial system connecting dozens of cultures. Caravans now travel under Persian protection from Egypt to Central Asia. Royal messengers carry orders across enormous distances. Different languages, religions, and customs exist side by side under the rule of one king. And yet the story is still only beginning. Cyrus himself will not live long enough to see how enormous his creation will become. But the empire he founded will continue expanding under future rulers, shaping the politics, trade and culture of the ancient world for generations. As evening settles once again across the Persian plateau, the fires of small villages flicker quietly beneath the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, the capital of a new empire begins to take shape. The name Persia is about to become known across the entire known world. Morning arrives slowly across the vast lands now ruled by Persia. The sun rises over distant mountains, casting long golden shadows across deserts, fertile valleys, and ancient cities that now share a single ruler. You travel along a wide road where caravans move steadily through the dust. Camels carry baskets of spices and woven fabrics. Traders speak different languages as they pass one another. Some come from Egypt, others from Babylon, and still others from distant lands beyond the mountains of Central Asia. What you are witnessing is something new in human history. The empire created by Cyrus has grown into a vast and diverse world of peoples and cultures. A widely recognized historical fact is that the Persian Empire, especially under the Achaemenid dynasty, eventually stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. Few earlier states had ever controlled territory on such a scale. Yet the most remarkable feature of this empire is not only its size, it is how many different societies exist within it. You continue walking through a busy city market somewhere in the western provinces of the empire. The smell of bread baking in clay ovens drifts through the air. Merchants call out prices while customers examine pottery, cloth, and metal tools. If you listen closely, you can hear several languages spoken at once: Aramaic, Persian, Egyptian, Greek, Babylonian. This mixture reflects a key element of Persian rule. Rather than forcing every region to adopt a single culture, the Persian kings allow many local traditions to continue. Temples remain active. Local officials still manage daily affairs. Religious customs vary widely from one province to another. This approach helps the empire maintain stability across enormous distances. One fascinating administrative system used by the Persians is the division of the empire into provinces called satrapies. Each satrapy is governed by an official known as a satrap who oversees taxes, security, and local administration. These governors report directly to the Persian king, yet the king does not rely on them alone. A lesser-known detail of Persian administration involves a network of royal inspectors, sometimes called the eyes and ears of the king. These officials travel quietly throughout the empire, checking on local governors and reporting back to the royal court if corruption or rebellion appears. You can imagine them arriving unexpectedly in distant towns, asking questions and observing carefully. Their presence reminds everyone that the authority of the Persian king extends far beyond the capital. Still, ruling such a massive empire remains a constant challenge. Messages must travel enormous distances. Rebellions can begin in faraway regions. Cultural differences sometimes create tension between provinces. To hold the empire together, Persian rulers develop an impressive system of infrastructure and communication. You now find yourself standing near a busy administrative center, where scribes record taxes and shipments of grain. Clay tablets and scrolls fill wooden shelves. Messengers prepare horses for long journeys between cities. Scholars who study this period often emphasize how advanced the Persian imperial system became for its time, but they also continue discussing how much control the central government truly maintained across such vast territory. Some researchers suggest that many regions operated with a great deal of local independence as long as taxes continued flowing to the royal treasury. Others argue that the Persian administration was more tightly organized than earlier historians once believed. The debate remains open. Meanwhile, life across the empire continues with remarkable variety. In Egypt, farmers still work along the fertile banks of the Nile. In Mesopotamia, priests maintain ancient temples that had existed for centuries before Persian rule. In Anatolia, Greek-speaking communities continue trading with cities across the Mediterranean. And on the Iranian plateau itself, Persian nobles gather in palaces decorated with elaborate carvings and stone reliefs. You walk through one such palace complex and pause to study the artwork carved into its walls. The stone figures show delegations from many different lands bringing gifts to the Persian king. Some carry gold vessels, others present textiles, animals, or baskets of rare goods. Each delegation wears clothing unique to its homeland. The carvings quietly celebrate the diversity of the empire. One small but interesting detail visible in these reliefs is the calm posture of the figures. Unlike the violent victory scenes often shown in other ancient empires, the Persian images emphasize cooperation and tribute rather than destruction. Some historians interpret this as a deliberate political message. The king presents himself not simply as a conqueror, but as a guardian of order among many nations. Whether this image fully matched reality remains a subject of historical discussion. Empires always contain both stability and tension beneath the surface. Still, the Persian system proves remarkably durable for its time. Trade flourishes across long distances. Roads connect cities that once had little contact with one another. Ideas travel alongside goods. A traveller leaving the Indus Valley could eventually reach the shores of the Mediterranean while passing entirely through territories under Persian authority. This enormous network begins shaping cultural exchanges that will influence history for centuries. As the sun moves higher in the sky, you continue along the road, watching the steady rhythm of imperial life unfold around you. Soldiers patrol distant frontiers. Tax collectors record shipments of silver and grain. Artisans craft jewellery and tools in bustling workshops, and above it all stands the figure of the Persian king. Yet maintaining such a vast empire will require more than organisation and diplomacy. Soon powerful neighbours will begin testing Persian strength. Across the western horizon lies a region of small but fiercely independent city-states known as Greece. Their world is very different from the empire you are walking through now, and before long the meeting between these two civilizations will lead to one of the most famous confrontations in ancient history. For the moment, however, the Persian Empire stands strong. The roads are busy, the provinces remain loyal, and the great imperial experiment of ruling many nations under one crown continues quietly beneath the warm light of the ancient sun. The morning air feels cool as you step once more onto the long road stretching across the Persian Empire. Dust rises gently beneath the hooves of horses and the padded feet of camels. Travellers move steadily in both directions, their shadows stretching across the ground in the early sunlight. This road beneath your feet is not just a simple path, it's part of one of the most remarkable transportation systems of the ancient world. A widely recognized historical fact is that the Persian Empire built an extensive network of roads connecting distant regions, the most famous of which was known as the Royal Road. This route stretched for more than 2,000 kilometers, linking the Persian heartland to the western city of Sardis in Anatolia. As you begin walking along it, the scale of this achievement slowly becomes clear. The road passes through fertile valleys, rugged mountain passes, and wide open plains. In some areas it is carefully paved, in others it is a well-maintained dirt path wide enough for wagons and riders to pass comfortably. Every so often you see small stations along the road. These stations serve an important purpose. Mounted couriers carrying royal messages can stop here to change horses and continue their journey at remarkable speed. This relay system allows news and orders to travel far faster than ordinary travellers could manage. One ancient historian once wrote with admiration that neither snow, rain, heat, nor darkness of night could stop the Persian couriers from completing their appointed rounds. You watch as one such messenger gallops past his horse, breathing hard from the long ride. He carries a sealed message that may contain orders affecting entire provinces. Within hours, another rider will take the message forward, then another, and another. In this way, the Persian king can send instructions across vast distances with surprising efficiency. Some historians view this communication system as one of the earliest large-scale examples of organized state infrastructure. It allows the empire to function not as a loose collection of territories, but as a connected political system. Yet researchers still discuss how evenly maintained the Royal Road truly was across its entire length. Archaeologists have found strong evidence of well-developed segments in some regions, while other stretches may have been simpler caravan tracks maintained mainly by local authorities. Even so, this network itself becomes a lifeline of imperial power. You continue travelling along the road and soon encounter a caravan of merchants moving slowly eastward. Their camels carry bundles wrapped in cloth and leather. The traders greet you politely as they pause beside a small stream to water their animals. Trade flourishes along these routes. Silk from distant eastern lands moves westward toward Mediterranean markets. Precious stones and spices travel across deserts and mountains. Textiles, metal goods, and pottery move between cities that once had little direct contact. One curious historical detail about Persian trade involves the use of standardized weights and measures across large parts of the empire. This system helps merchants calculate prices more easily when doing business far from home. It may seem like a small administrative decision, yet such practical measures help stabilize commerce across an enormous territory. As the sun climbs higher, the road grows busier. A group of soldiers rides past in polished armour, their spears glinting in the light. They belong to one of these imperial garrisons, responsible for protecting key routes and maintaining order. Farther ahead, you see a convoy of wagons carrying grain collected as taxes from nearby farming communities. The supplies are destined for storage depots that support both cities and military forces. All of this activity reveals how carefully the empire organises movement and resources. But the Royal Road is more than just an economic pathway. It also becomes a channel through which the ideas and cultures travel. You notice travellers wearing clothing from many different lands. Some speak Greek, others speak languages from Mesopotamia or Central Asia. A few carry religious symbols unfamiliar to you. Through constant movement along these roads, cultures begin influencing one another in subtle ways. Architectural styles spread from one region to another. Stories and myths travel with wandering storytellers. Musical instruments and artistic designs appear in places far from where they originated. Many historians see the Persian road network as an early engine of cultural exchange across Eurasia. Yet despite the remarkable efficiency of this system, maintaining unity across such a large empire remains a delicate balancing act. Rebellions occasionally erupt in distant provinces. Local rulers sometimes resist taxation or challenge imperial authority. Messages travelling along these roads may carry warnings as often as they carry routine orders. You pass a small fortified outpost where soldiers stand watch over a narrow mountain pass. Their presence reminds travellers that the peace of the empire depends partly on military strength. Beyond the pass lies another valley filled with scattered villages and farming terraces. As evening approaches, you reach one of the larger way stations where travellers gather for the night. Horses rest in fenced enclosures while merchants share meals beside cooking fires. The smell of roasted grain and herbs drifts through the cooling air. A storyteller begins recounting news from distant lands. He speaks of cities along the Western Sea where independent Greek communities govern themselves rather than serving a king. These stories attract quiet curiosity. The Greek world seems very different from the vast imperial system you've been walking through. Instead of one powerful ruler controlling many nations, Greece consists of dozens of fiercely independent city-states. For now, they remain distant neighbours, but before long tensions between Persia and these Greek communities will begin to grow. Trade politics and pride will all play their part, and the road you have been travelling may soon carry armies as well as merchants. Night settles gently over the royal road. Travellers roll themselves in blankets beside their wagons. Horses shift quietly in the dark. Above you the sky fills with stars stretching endlessly across the heavens. Somewhere far away, another royal messenger begins a long ride through the darkness. The empire never truly sleeps. The night slowly fades as pale light spreads across the western edges of the Persian Empire. A cool wind moves through the hills of Anatolia, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant sea air. You stand near a rocky ridge looking westward toward the lands that feel different from the imperial world you have been walking through. Beyond these hills lies Greece. Unlike the vast unified empire ruled by the Persian king, the Greek world is divided into many independent city-states. Each city governs itself, each guards its independence fiercely. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. To Persian administrators, these scattered communities may seem small and disorganized, yet their strong sense of autonomy will soon bring them into direct conflict with one of the most powerful empires the ancient world has ever known. A widely accepted historical fact is that tensions between Persia and the Greek city-states began growing in the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, particularly after Persia expanded into the eastern Mediterranean. Several Greek cities along the coast of Anatolia had already come under Persian rule. These cities were culturally Greek but politically part of the Persian imperial system. For a time, this arrangement worked, but unrest slowly began to build. You walk through one of these coastal cities where traders unload goods at a busy harbour. Greek merchants speak quietly among themselves while Persian officials record taxes and shipments. Many citizens here live with divided loyalties. Their language, traditions, and identity connect them to Greece, yet their political authority now comes from the Persian king. Eventually tension turns into rebellion. In 499 BC, several Greek cities in Anatolia revolt against Persian rule. The uprising becomes known as the Ionian Revolt. Athens, one of the most influential Greek city-states, sends ships and soldiers to support the rebels. From the Persian perspective, this assistance is a direct challenge to imperial authority. You can imagine the message travelling eastward along the royal road. Couriers ride swiftly through mountain passes carrying reports of the rebellion to the Persian court. The empire has faced revolts before, yet this one involves foreign interference from distant Greek cities that have never been part of Persian rule. The Persian king at this time is Darius I, one of the most capable rulers of the Achaemenid dynasty. Darius is known for strengthening the administrative systems of the empire, building grand palaces and expanding Persian territory. Now he faces a new challenge. After several years of fighting, Persian forces eventually crush the Ionian revolt, but the involvement of Athens has left a lasting impression. According to ancient accounts, Darius reportedly ordered a servant to remind him daily of Athens and its role in the uprising. Whether this dramatic detail is entirely accurate remains uncertain. Some historians suspect that Greek writers may have exaggerated the story to emphasize the personal rivalry between Persia and Athens. Even so, Darius soon begins preparing a military expedition toward Greece. You now find yourself walking along a coastline where Persian ships gather in large numbers. Soldiers load supplies while commanders study maps of unfamiliar lands across the sea. The goal is not simply punishment. Persia wants to secure its western frontier and prevent further interference in its territories. The first major clash occurs in 490 BCE at a place that will later become famous in history. Marathon. You stand on a wide coastal plain outside Athens where two very different armies face one another. On one side stand Persian forces supported by cavalry and archers. On the other side are Greek hoplites' heavily armoured infantry soldiers carrying large shields and long spears. The battlefield is quiet in the early morning light. A curious historical detail about this moment is that the Persian cavalry, normally a major advantage, may not have been present on the field when the battle began. Some researchers believe the horses had been temporarily reloaded onto ships. This detail remains debated among historians. Archaeologists and military historians still discuss exactly how events unfolded that day. But what is widely agreed upon is that the Greek forces launched an aggressive attack, charging across the plain toward the Persian lines. The clash is intense but relatively brief. Despite their smaller numbers, the Greek hoplites managed to break through the Persian formation. The Persian army retreats toward its ships while Greek soldiers push forward. For Athens, the victory becomes a powerful symbol of independence. For Persia, it is a setback, but not a final defeat. Darius begins preparing a much larger campaign to bring Greece firmly under Persian influence. However, fate intervenes. Before the next invasion can begin, Darius dies. His son Xerxes will eventually take up the task. As you continue your journey through this moment in history, the scale of the coming conflict becomes clearer. Persia commands vast resources drawn from many provinces across its empire. Greece, by contrast, remains politically divided and geographically fragmented. Yet the determination of these small city-states should not be underestimated. Some scholars continued debating whether the Greek victories that will soon follow truly saved Western civilization as earlier historians often claimed. Modern researchers sometimes argue that this interpretation reflects later cultural pride rather than objective analysis. History, after all, is rarely as simple as heroic legends suggest. For now, the winds along the Aegean coast grow stronger. Ships gather. Armies prepare. Two very different political worlds are moving slowly towards a dramatic confrontation. And the next chapter of the Persian story will unfold not only across the plains of Greece, but across the entire ancient world. A soft morning mist drifts across the ruins of ancient battlefields as you continue your journey through time. The wars between Persia and the Greek city-states have already reshaped the western edges of the empire. Stories of Marathon have travelled along the royal road, carried by merchants, soldiers, and royal messengers alike. Yet history rarely pauses for long. Empires continue moving forward and new forces slowly rise on the horizon. You now find yourself standing more than a century after those early Persian-Greek wars. The once mighty Achaemenid Empire still stretches across enormous territories, but the balance of power in the ancient world has begun shifting. Far to the west, in the rugged land of Macedonia, a young king named Alexander is preparing something extraordinary. A widely recognized historical fact is that Alexander III of Macedon, later known as Alexander the Great, launched his campaign against Persia in 334 BCE. At the time, the Persian Empire was ruled by King Darius III, whose authority faced growing internal challenges. The empire Alexander is about to confront is still immense, but it no longer possesses the same overwhelming stability it once enjoyed under earlier rulers like Cyrus and Darius I. You walk through a Persian provincial city where officials continue collecting taxes and recording shipments of grain. Life still appears orderly on the surface. Markets remain busy. Caravans arrive from distant regions. Temples conduct familiar rituals, yet whispers of trouble circulate quietly among travelers. Some provinces show signs of unrest. Rivalries within the Persian elite weaken central authority. Communication across such vast distances grows increasingly difficult to manage. Scholars who study this period often discuss how the internal instability may have made the empire more vulnerable to external attack. However, researchers continue debating exactly how fragile Persia truly was before Alexander's invasion. Some historians argue the empire remained strong and that Alexander's success was simply the result of extraordinary military leadership. Others believe deeper structural problems had already begun eroding Persian power. The truth likely lies somewhere between those interpretations. Meanwhile, Alexander's army begins moving eastward. You imagine the scene as thousands of Macedonian soldiers cross into Asia Minor. Their armour glints under the Mediterranean sun while long spears known as sarissas rise above the marching ranks like a forest of steel. Alexander himself rides at the front, young, ambitious and determined to defeat the greatest empire of his time. The first major clash occurs near a river called the Granicus. Persian forces attempt to block Alexander's advance, but the Macedonian army pushes across the river and breaks through their defences. The victory opens the door for Alexander to move deeper into Persian territory. Soon the campaign becomes a sweeping series of battles across the empire. One particularly dramatic moment arrives at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE. You stand on a narrow coastal plain where the armies of Alexander and King Darius III face one another directly. The Persian king commands a much larger force drawn from many parts of the empire. Archers, cavalry units, infantry from distant provinces. Yet the battlefield geography limits how effectively these numbers can be deployed. Alexander launches a bold attack toward the centre of the Persian line, aiming directly for the position of Darius himself. As the fighting intensifies, Darius eventually retreats from the field. Once the king withdraws, much of the Persian army begins to collapse into disorder. Another fascinating detail from ancient sources describes the immense royal camp left behind after this battle. When Alexander entered it, he reportedly discovered luxurious tents, fine furniture and vast quantities of treasure belonging to the Persian court. These descriptions may have been somewhat exaggerated by later writers eager to highlight the dramatic contrast between Persian wealth and Macedonian discipline. Even so, they hint at the enormous resources the Persian Empire had accumulated over centuries. But Alexander's campaign continues. 2 years later, another decisive battle unfolds at Gaugamela in 331 BCE. The plain stretches wide beneath the open sky, carefully chosen by the Persian army to allow their cavalry and chariots maximum mobility. King Darius once again commands a large force, yet Alexander's army proves remarkably flexible and coordinated. Through clever maneuvers and disciplined formations, the Macedonian troops manage to create a gap in the Persian line. Alexander drives his cavalry directly toward Darius. Facing the possibility of capture, the Persian king retreats once again. This moment effectively ends Achaemenid rule. Cities across the empire soon surrender to Alexander's advancing forces. One by one, the great centres of Persian power fall under Macedonian control. You walk through the grand halls of Persepolis, one of the ceremonial capitals of the Persian Empire. The stone columns and carved reliefs still stand tall, decorated with images of tribute bearers from distant lands. Here something Sibyllic occurs. Ancient accounts describe a great fire that eventually destroys large parts of the palace complex. Some historians believe Alexander ordered the destruction as revenge for earlier Persian invasions of Greece. Others suggest the fire may have been the result of a drunken celebration that spiraled out of control. The exact cause remains uncertain. Archaeologists continue studying the ruins, searching for clues that might clarify what truly happened that night. Regardless of the cause, the burning of Persepolis becomes a powerful symbol. The empire founded by Cyrus the Great has fallen, yet Persian culture itself does not disappear. In fact, Alexander soon adopts several elements of Persian court traditions. He begins wearing Persian royal clothing and encourages marriages between Macedonian officers and Persian noble families. These decisions reveal something interesting about the resilience of Persian civilization. Even the conqueror who defeated the empire finds himself influenced by its traditions. As evening settles across the ancient Persian heartland, you walk quietly among the remaining columns of Persepolis. The wind moves gently through the ruins, carrying echoes of a civilization that shaped the ancient world. Empires may rise and fall, but the deeper cultural identity of Persia is far from finished. Another chapter of the story is already beginning. The desert wind moves softly across the Iranian plateau as the centuries continue unfolding around you. The empire of Cyrus and Darius has fallen, and the armies of Alexander the Great have swept across Persia like a sudden storm. Yet history rarely leaves a land empty for long. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his enormous empire begins to fracture. You imagine standing inside a once grand administrative city somewhere in Persia. Greek-speaking officials now occupy buildings that once served Persian governors. Macedonian soldiers patrol the streets while traders continue their ordinary routines in crowded markets. The world has changed, yet many familiar rhythms remain. Alexander's successors, known as the Diadochi, divide his territories into competing kingdoms. Persia eventually becomes part of the Seleucid Empire ruled by Greek Macedonian elites from distant capitals. At first, the Seleucid rulers attempt to maintain control over the vast eastern provinces Alexander conquered. Greek-style cities are founded. Greek language and customs spread through administrative centres. But maintaining authority across such immense distances proves difficult. A widely accepted historical fact is that the Seleucid Empire gradually struggled to maintain control over its eastern territories. Local leaders and nomadic groups began asserting greater independence as the central government weakened. Among those rising powers were a group known as the Parthians. You now travel northeast toward the wide steppes near the Caspian Sea where the Parthian story begins. The Parthians originally belonged to a confederation of nomadic tribes who lived along the borders of the Iranian plateau. They were skilled horse riders accustomed to the wide open landscapes where speed and mobility meant survival. Their lifestyle differed greatly from the settled agricultural societies of Mesopotamia or the imperial administrative centres of earlier Persian rulers. Instead of large cities and elaborate bureaucracies, the Parthian world centered around warrior aristocrats, tribal alliances, and cavalry warfare. One fascinating detail about Parthian military tactics becomes famous across the ancient world. It involves a maneuver later known as the Parthian shot. Imagine a mounted archer galloping away from an enemy while suddenly twisting backward in the saddle to fire arrows behind him. This technique allows Parthian horse archers to strike while appearing to retreat, confusing and exhausting opposing forces. Ancient writers often describe this tactic with both frustration and admiration. The Parthians did not rely on heavily armoured infantry formations like the Greeks or Romans. Instead, they used speed, flexibility, and precise archery to dominate open battlefields. But before their military reputation spreads across the region, the Parthians must first establish political power. Around the mid-3rd century BCE, a leader named Arsaces begins challenging Seleucid authority in northeastern Iran. Arsaces and his followers seized territory and gradually established control over parts of the region known as Parthia. This moment marks the beginning of the Arsacid dynasty, the ruling house that will eventually transform the Parthians into a major imperial force. At first, the new Parthian kingdom remains relatively full. Yet the Seleucid Empire continues weakening due to internal struggles and external conflicts. This instability gives the Parthians an opportunity. Over several generations, Parthian rulers slowly expand their territory westward across the Iranian plateau. Cities that once answered to Greek Macedonian governors now come under Parthian authority. The process is gradual rather than sudden. Trade continues. Local cultures persist and coexist. Administrative systems adapt to new leadership. Some historians describe this transition as less of a dramatic conquest and more of a slow political shift as regional power balances changed. However, scholars still debate exactly how centralized the Parthian state truly was. Unlike the earlier Achaemenid Empire, which maintained a highly organized administrative network, the Parthian system appears to have been more decentralized. Powerful, noble families often controlled large territories while acknowledging the authority of the Parthian king. This arrangement created both flexibility and instability. On one hand, local leaders had strong incentives to support the empire because they retained significant autonomy. On the other hand, internal rivalries among noble houses sometimes weakened the unity of the kingdom. Despite these challenges, Parthian power continues growing. You walk through a newly thriving city along an important trade route. Merchants arrive from distant regions carrying silk from China, spices from India, and glassware from the Mediterranean. The Parthian realm now occupies a strategic position between East and West. This location allows the empire to benefit enormously from long-distance trade networks that later generations will call the Silk Road. Another interesting historical detail is that Parthian rulers often adopted elements of earlier Persian traditions while also incorporating Greek influences left behind by the Seleucid period. Coins issued by Parthian kings sometimes feature Greek inscriptions, while their royal titles and ceremonies draw from older Iranian customs. This blending of cultural traditions reflects the complex history of the region. Persian identity never fully disappeared under foreign rule. Instead, it slowly evolved. As the sun begins to set across the plateau, the Parthian kingdom continues expanding its influence. But a powerful new rival soon appears on the western horizon. Beyond the deserts and mountains lies the Roman Republic, which is rapidly transforming into one of the most formidable political forces in the Mediterranean world. Before long, these two great powers will collide across the frontier lands of the Middle East, and the Parthian horsemen you see riding across the plains today will become legendary adversaries of Rome. The story of Persia, it seems, is far from over. It is simply entering another chapter. A quiet dawn spreads across the wide plains of the Iranian plateau. The Parthian Empire has ruled these lands for centuries now. Horsemen ride across the open countryside, caravans move along dusty trade routes, and cities continue growing at the crossroads between east and west. Yet beneath the surface of Parthian rule, new ambitions are beginning to take shape. You find yourself travelling through the southern regions of Persia, where an older memory still lingers in the land itself. Ruins of ancient Achaemenid palaces stand as silent reminders of the empire founded by Cyrus the Great long ago. Stone columns rise from the ground like echoes of a forgotten age. Many people living here still remember those earlier kings. Among them are noble families who trace their ancestry back to the old Persian dynasties. One of these families is about to change history. A widely accepted historical fact is that in the early 3rd century CE, a ruler named Ardashir I launched a rebellion against the Parthian Empire. Ardashir belonged to a regional dynasty in Persis, the same southern homeland from which the ancient Achaemenid Empire had once emerged. You imagine him standing in a fortified city somewhere in this region looking across the land that once belonged to the ancestors of Persia. Ardashir begins gathering supporters. Local nobles, warriors, and administrators slowly align themselves with his cause. The Parthian Empire, though still powerful, has grown weakened by internal rivalries between noble houses. These divisions create an opportunity. Ardashir's forces expand outward from Persis, defeating several Parthian governors along the way. As his reputation grows, more supporters join his movement. Eventually, the conflict reaches its decisive moment. In 224 CE, Ardashir confronts the Parthian king Artabanus IV in a major battle. The exact details of the clash remain somewhat unclear, but historical sources agree that Ardashir emerges victorious. With that victory, the Parthian Empire collapses. A new dynasty rises in its place, the Sassanid Empire. You now walk through the newly strengthened Persian capital where Ardashir begins rebuilding a powerful centralized state. Unlike the more decentralized structure of the Parthians, the Sassanid rulers attempt to restore stronger imperial authority similar to the ancient Achaemenid model. Royal ceremonies return with renewed grandeur. Court officials organize elaborate administrative system. Persian identity begins receiving renewed emphasis in political and cultural life. One fascinating detail about the early Sassanid rulers is their deliberate effort to connect themselves with the legacy of the earlier Persian Empire. Royal inscriptions and artwork often portray the kings as heirs to the ancient traditions of Cyrus and Darius. This symbolic connection helps strengthen their legitimacy. At the same time, the Sassanids place increasing importance on a religion that had already existed in Persia for centuries, Zoroastrianism. Fire temples appear across the empire, and priests known as magi gain greater influence in state affairs. Sacred fires burn continuously inside temple sanctuaries representing purity and divine truth. Zoroastrian beliefs emphasize a cosmic struggle between forces of good and evil, a moral framework that resonates strongly with the Sassanid rulers' vision of order and justice. Yet scholars still discuss how strictly these religious policies were enforced across the empire. Some researchers argue that Zoroastrian institutions became closely tied to royal authority, while others believe local religious diversity remained relatively common in many regions. Persia has always been a land of many cultures and beliefs. The Sassanid rulers understand that governing such a diverse population requires balance. You continue walking through a growing Sassanid city where artisans shape metalwork, weave textiles, and carve intricate designs into stone. Markets remain lively with traders bringing goods from India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. The empire's strategic position along major trade routes ensures steady economic activity. But the Sassanid kings are not focused only on trade and culture. They also rebuild the Persian military into a formidable force. Heavy cavalry units, known as cataphracts, become the backbone of Sassanid armies. Riders wear thick armour, and their horses are sometimes protected by metal plates as well. These cavalry formations are designed to deliver powerful charges capable of breaking enemy lines. As you watch soldiers training outside a fortified city, it becomes clear that the Sassanid Empire intends to defend its power aggressively. And there is one particular rival that demands constant attention. To the west lies the Roman Empire. For centuries, Rome has expanded across the Mediterranean world, absorbing territories and establishing strong frontier defences. Now the Roman and Sassanid empires face each other across the deserts and rivers of the Middle East. Two great civilizations, two powerful imperial systems, both determined to protect their influence. One lesser-known historical detail involves the diplomatic exchanges that sometimes occurred between these rival empires. Ambassadors travelled between royal courts carrying gifts, letters, and proposals meant to maintain temporary peace. These diplomatic moments reveal that the relationship between Rome and Persia was not always defined by war. Still, conflict remains frequent. Border regions shift back and forth between the two powers as armies march across contested territories. Some historians describe the Roman-Sassanid rivalry as one of the longest-running geopolitical struggles of the ancient world. Yet archaeologists and historians continue discussing how these conflicts affected ordinary people living in frontier regions. While large battles dominate historical records, everyday life in many towns may have continued with some surprising stability during long periods between major wars. History often remembers the dramatic moments, but daily life moves quietly beneath them. As evening approaches, the fires of Sassanid cities glow warmly against the darkening sky. Merchants close their stalls while soldiers patrol the city walls. The Persian world has risen once again as a powerful empire, and this new dynasty will soon become one of Rome's greatest rivals. The ancient story of Persia continues unfolding. The morning sun rises slowly over a frontier landscape where two great worlds meet. The air carries the dry scent of desert wind, and in the distance a long line of fortified walls and watchtowers stretches across the horizon. You're standing near the borderlands between two powerful empires. To the west lies the Roman world, vast and wealthy, with cities that circle the Mediterranean Sea. To the east spreads the Sassanid Empire, the revived Persian power that now dominates the Iranian plateau and the lands beyond. Between them lies a frontier that will remain contested for centuries. A widely accepted historical fact is that the Roman and Sassanid empires became the two dominant superpowers of the Near East during late antiquity. From the 3rd century onward, their rivalry shaped the political landscape of the Middle East. You begin walking along a dusty road that connects several frontier towns. Traders move cautiously through the region, escorted by small groups of soldiers who keep watch for bandits or hostile patrols. Life near imperial borders always carries a certain tension. Yet despite the military presence, ordinary activity continues. Farmers work fields beside irrigation canals. Merchants sell goods in crowded marketplaces. Children play in narrow streets between mud brick homes. For many people living here, the great rivalry between Rome and Persia forms a distant backdrop to everyday life. Still, the balance of power between the two empires shifts frequently. Sometimes Roman armies advance eastward across the Euphrates River. At other times, Persian forces push west into territories controlled by Rome. One dramatic episode occurs during the reign of the Sassanid king Shapur I in the 3rd century. You imagine the scene as Persian cavalry rides across open plains toward Roman strongholds. Shapur leads a series of campaigns that challenge Roman authority in the region. Eventually, in the year 260 CE, something extraordinary happens. A Roman emperor named Valerian marches east to confront the Persians. The two armies meet near the city of Edessa. The battle ends in a shocking result. Valerian is captured. Ancient sources describe the Roman emperor being taken prisoner by the Persian king, an event almost unimaginable in the Roman world where emperors were considered nearly invincible figures. This becomes one of the most famous victories in Sassanid history. In fact, the event is immortalized in stone reliefs carved into cliffs across Persia. These carvings show Shapur on horseback receiving the submission of the captured Roman emperor. Yet the story does not end there. Historians still debate the details of Valerian's captivity. Some ancient writers claim he was treated harshly and forced into humiliating roles. Others believe these stories may have been exaggerated by later Roman authors seeking to dramatize the defeat. Archaeologists and historians continue examining the evidence, trying to separate legend from reality. Regardless of the exact circumstances, the capture of a Roman emperor sends a powerful message across the ancient world. Persia is once again a force capable of challenging Rome. You continue travelling along the frontier and eventually reach a fortified Roman city. Thick stone walls surround the settlement while soldiers patrol the towers overlooking the desert. Inside the gates, life continues with surprising normality. Merchants trade spices and fabrics imported from distant lands. Roman administrators collect taxes and maintain official records. The architecture combines Roman engineering with local building traditions shaped by centuries of Persian influence. This blending of cultures is one of the fascinating aspects of life along the Roman-Persian frontier. Ideas travel almost as easily as armies. Artistic styles mix together. Languages overlap in markets and government offices. Even military tactics sometimes influence both sides. One interesting historical detail involves the exchange of technologies between the two empires. Techniques in fortification, design, siege, warfare and cavalry organization gradually spread through repeated encounters between Roman and Persian forces. War ironically often accelerates cultural exchange, but conflict is never far away. You stand on a hillside watching dust rise in the distance as a column of soldiers marches across the frontier road. Their armour glints under the afternoon sun while banners ripple in the warm wind. Border wars erupt periodically as each empire attempts to secure strategic cities and trade routes. Some campaigns last only a few months. Others stretch across several years, draining resources and exhausting both sides. Scholars studying this long rivalry sometimes question whether either empire truly achieved lasting dominance over the region. Territories frequently changed hands and victories often proved temporary. Instead of a single decisive outcome, the Roman-Persian struggle became a prolonged balance of power. Each side remained strong enough to prevent the other from gaining permanent control. Meanwhile, trade continued flowing through the region. Caravans from Central Asia carried silk and precious goods westward. Roman merchants exchanged glassware, wine, and manufactured goods. The frontier became both a battlefield and a bridge between civilizations. As evening settles across the desert landscape, the watchfires along the frontier walls begin glowing softly in the darkness. Roman soldiers stand guard on one side. Persian patrols watch from the other. Between them stretches a fragile line of tension that has shaped centuries of history. Yet beyond these guarded borders, something new is quietly beginning in the southern deserts of Arabia, a movement that will soon transform the entire Middle East. And when that moment arrives, both the Roman and Persian empires will face a challenge unlike anything they have encountered before. For now, however, the long rivalry continues beneath the silent desert stars. A cool wind moves across the wide plains of Mesopotamia, as the long struggle between Persia and Rome slowly exhausts both empires. For centuries their armies have marched across these lands. Cities have changed rulers more than once. Fortresses have been built, destroyed, and rebuilt again. Yet as you walk through a frontier town at the edge of the Sassanid world, something feels different now. The empire that once stood as Rome's greatest rival is beginning to show signs of strain. A widely recognized historical fact is that by the early 7th century, the Sassanid Empire had been locked in an incredibly destructive war with the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome. This final great conflict between the two powers would last for more than 2 decades. You imagine the enormous scale of that struggle. Persian armies push westward, capturing major cities across the Middle East. At one point, they even seized Jerusalem and parts of Egypt, regions long considered vital to Byzantine power. For a moment, it seems as though Persia might finally achieve a decisive victory over its ancient rival. But history rarely unfolds in straight lines. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launches a daring counterattack. His forces move deep into Persian territory, striking at the heart of the Sassanid state. Battle after battle drains both sides. Treasuries weaken, cities suffer, armies grow weary after years of constant campaigning. Scholars often describe this war as one of the most devastating conflicts of late antiquity. The two superpowers of the region poured enormous resources into the struggle, leaving both their empires weakened by the time the fighting finally ended. And even after the war stops, the Sassanid Empire faces internal turmoil. You walk through the once magnificent halls of the Persian royal court where uncertainty now fills the air. Noble families argue over succession, rival factions compete for influence. In a short span of years, several kings rise and fall from the throne. One lesser-known historical detail is that after the death of the powerful ruler Khosrow II, the empire experienced an astonishing period of political instability. Multiple rulers claimed authority in rapid succession, sometimes holding power for only a few months before being replaced. Such instability makes it difficult for any government to function effectively. Tax systems falter, provincial governors act independently, military commanders struggle to maintain discipline among tired soldiers. Historians studying this period continue discussing how much these internal divisions weakened the Sassanid state before the arrival of new external threats. Some researchers argue that the empire still possessed considerable strength and might have recovered if given time. Others believe the political chaos had already damaged its foundations beyond easy repair. While these debates continue, events far to the south are quietly gathering momentum. You turn your gaze toward the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. For centuries, this region existed largely outside the direct control of both the Roman and Persian empires. Nomadic tribes moved across its harsh landscapes while caravan cities thrived along long-distance trade routes. Yet during the early 7th century, something extraordinary begins unfolding in the city of Mecca. A man named Muhammad begins preaching a new religious message centered on the worship of one God. At first, the movement appears small. A handful of followers gather quietly to listen to the teachings of Islam. But over time, the message spreads. Tribal alliances shift. Communities unite under a new shared belief. The Arabian Peninsula gradually becomes politically and spiritually transformed. As you walk through a Persian border town, you hear merchants discussing unusual news from the south. Armies formed by newly unified Arab tribes are beginning to move beyond Arabia's deserts. At first, the Sassanid leadership may not fully grasp the scale of what is coming. After all, Persia has faced nomadic raids and frontier skirmishes before. But this movement is different. The Arab forces are motivated not only by tribal alliances, but by a powerful religious identity that unites them across regions. Within a few years, these armies begin advancing into territories once controlled by the great empires of the Middle East. You imagine the tension building across the Persian frontier as reports arrive out of unexpected defeats and rapidly moving forces. Persian commanders attempt to organize resistance. Yet the empire they defend is still recovering from decades of war and political turmoil. One of the decisive moments arrives at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah around 636 CE. On a wide plain near the Euphrates River, Persian and Arab armies confront one another in a long and exhausting battle. Ancient sources describe intense fighting lasting several days. War elephants used by the Persian forces initially cause confusion among the opposing troops, but the Arab armies adapt quickly, eventually managing to drive the elephants away and break the Persian lines. Archaeologists and historians continue examining historical accounts of this battle, discussing how different tactical decisions influenced the outcome. But the result itself is clear. Persian resistance begins collapsing. Cities that once formed the backbone of the Sassanid state fall one after another. Ctesiphon, the magnificent imperial capital along the Tigris River, is eventually abandoned. As evening settles across the ancient Persian heartland, the final ruler of the Sassanid dynasty, Yazdegerd III, moves from place to place seeking support for a last resistance. But the world around him has already changed. The empire that once rivaled Rome for centuries is fading. Yet the story of Persia is not ending. It is transforming. A new chapter is beginning, one shaped by the arrival of Islam and the merging of Persian culture with a rapidly expanding Islamic civilization. The land remains the same, but the civilization living upon it is about to evolve in ways no one standing here tonight could yet imagine. The early morning air feels cooler as you step into a world that has just changed in ways few could have imagined only a generation earlier. The great Sassanid Empire has collapsed, and the lands of Persia now fall under the authority of a rapidly expanding Islamic world. Yet the landscape around you still looks familiar. The same mountains rise along the horizon. Rivers continue flowing through fertile valleys. Cities that once belonged to Persian kings now open their gates to new rulers arriving from the deserts of Arabia. History rarely replaces one civilization completely with another. Instead, cultures blend, adapt, and reshape themselves. A widely recognized historical fact is that by the middle of the 7th century, Arab Muslim armies had conquered most of the former Sassanid territories. Persia became part of the growing Islamic Caliphate, a political and religious system that stretched across vast areas of the Middle East and beyond. You walk through the streets of a once Persian administrative city where new officials are establishing authority. Arabic language begins appearing in government records. New governors appointed by the caliph administer taxes and law. Yet daily life for many people continues with surprising continuity. Farmers still tend the same fields. Merchants still travel the familiar trade routes. Craftsmen continue working in workshops that existed long before the arrival of the new rulers. This gradual blending of old and new becomes one of the defining features of early Islamic Persia. One interesting detail from this period involves the administrative experience that Persian officials brought into the Islamic state. Many bureaucratic practices developed under earlier Persian empires proved extremely useful for governing large territories. As a result, Persian administrators often continued working within the new political system. Their knowledge of taxation infrastructure and regional management helped the caliphate maintain stability across newly conquered lands. Historians sometimes describe this process as the quiet integration of Persian expertise into Islamic governance. Yet the transition was not entirely smooth. For many communities, the shift in political power created uncertainty. Some regions resisted to the new authority for several years before fully accepting it. Local revolts occurred in different areas of Persia during the early decades after the conquest. Scholars continue discussing how widespread this resistance truly was. Some historians believe opposition to Arab rule remained limited and localized. Others argue that the process of integrating Persia into the Islamic world involved a longer period of negotiation and adaptation than earlier narratives suggested. Whatever the case, the new cultural environment soon begins shaping Persian society in lasting ways. You enter a city mosque where early Muslim communities gather for prayer. The architecture feels simple compared to the elaborate fire temples of the Sassanid period. Yet the atmosphere carries a sense of unity. People from different tribes and regions stand together in rows, bowing in shared worship. The message of Islam emphasizes a universal community of believers transcending tribal and ethnic divisions. Over time, more people across Persia gradually adopt the new faith. Conversion does not happen instantly. For several generations, many communities continue practicing older traditions while interacting with Islamic institutions. Archaeologists studying this era have found evidence suggesting that Zoroastrian religious life continued in some regions for stories after the Arab conquest. This slow cultural transition reminds us that religious change rarely occurs overnight. Meanwhile, Persian culture itself begins influencing the Islamic world. You wander through a scholarly gathering where poets, theologians, and administrators exchange ideas. Persian traditions of literature, philosophy, and governance gradually become woven into the intellectual fabric of the expanding Islamic civilization. One fascinating detail from this era involves the role of the Persian language itself. Although Arabic becomes the primary language of religion and administration across much of the Islamic world, Persian continues to survive in everyday life among the population. For several centuries it evolves quietly alongside Arabic. Eventually a new literary form, known as New Persian, begins emerging, written using the Arabic script, but preserving the structure of the older Persian language. This development will later allow Persian poetry and literature to flourish once again. As evening settles across the city, lanterns glow along narrow streets while scholars continue their conversations inside quiet courtyards. The cultural exchange happening here is shaping a new kind of civilization, Islamic in religion, but deeply influenced by Persian traditions. Some researchers describe this transformation as one of the most important cultural syntheses in world history. Others caution that the process was far more gradual and complex than simple labels might suggest. Historians still examine countless manuscripts, inscriptions, and archaeological remains to better understand how Persian identity evolved during these centuries. What becomes clear is that Persia did not disappear after the Arab conquest. Instead, it adapted. Its language survived, its cultural memory endured, and its intellectual traditions soon began contributing powerfully to the broader Islamic world. As the stars appear over the quiet rooftops, you realize that Persia is once again transforming itself within a new historical environment. The empire may be gone, but the civilization remains very much alive. And in the centuries ahead, Persian scholars, poets, and thinkers will help shape one of the most vibrant intellectual periods in human history. The story of Persia continues quietly unfolding beneath the lantern light of medieval cities. The quiet hum of a medieval Persian city greets you as dawn slowly brightens the sky. Narrow streets wind between mud brick houses, and the soft call to prayer echoes from the tall minaret of a nearby mosque. Merchants are already opening their stalls, arranging baskets of fruit, spices, and woven cloth. Although Persia now belongs to the vast Islamic Caliphate, something within the culture of the land continues to feel distinctly Persian. The old empire has vanished, but the civilization beneath it has not disappeared. A widely accepted historical fact is that during the early centuries of Islamic rule, Persian scholars, administrators, and intellectuals played an increasingly important role in shaping the governance and culture of the Islamic world. Many caliphs relied heavily on Persian advisors who understood the complex systems of administration inherited from earlier empires. You walk through a government office where scribes carefully record tax collections and land ownership. Some documents are written in Arabic, the official language of the Islamic State. Yet the men doing the writing often come from Persian families whose ancestors once served earlier dynasties. Their knowledge of administration proves extremely valuable. One intriguing historical detail involves a famous Persian family known as the Barmakids. For several generations, they served as powerful advisors to the Abbasid caliphs, helping manage the vast bureaucratic machinery of the empire. Originally connected to a Buddhist monastery in Central Asia before converting to Islam, the Barmakids represent the surprising cultural blending taking place across the region. Their rise shows how Persian elites were able to adapt and thrive within the new Islamic political system. Yet the influence of Persia during this era extends far beyond government administration. You enter a quiet courtyard where scholars sit on woven carpets discussing philosophy and science. Scrolls and the manuscripts lie open beside them as they debate questions about mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. The Islamic world at this time is experiencing a remarkable intellectual flourishing. Many historians call this period the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars across cities such as Baghdad, Nishapur, and Rayyi translate ancient Greek, Indian, and Persian texts into Arabic. Knowledge from different civilizations merges and expands through lively debate and experimentation. Persian thinkers contribute strongly to this intellectual movement. Some researchers even suggest that the cultural environment of Persia, with its long traditions of scholarship and administration, helped create fertile ground for scientific advancement. Of course, historians continue discussing how much credit should be assigned to different regions during this era. Intellectual developments often emerge from complex networks of cultural exchange rather than from any single civilization alone. Still, Persian cities quickly become major centers of learning. You walk into a library where shelves of manuscripts fill the walls. Students copy texts by hand while teachers explain complex ideas about medicine and mathematics. In another part of the city, poets gather in the evening to recite verses filled with vivid imagery and philosophical reflection. Poetry holds a special place in Persian culture. One small but fascinating detail is that Persian literary gatherings sometimes function almost like social clubs where intellectuals exchange ideas, entertain guests, and celebrate artistic creativity. Poetry readings may continue late into the night while listeners sip tea and discuss the deeper meanings hidden within the verses. This love of literature will soon lead to one of the most important cultural developments in Persian history, the rebirth of the Persian language itself. Although Arabic remains dominant in many official contexts, Persian gradually re-emerges as a powerful literary language. By the 9th and 10th centuries, poets begin composing works in what scholars call New Persian. This language combines the structure of Older Persian with a vocabulary influenced by Arabic. You can imagine the excitement among writers and storytellers who suddenly find themselves able to express complex ideas in a language closely tied to their cultural identity. One of the most famous literary achievements of this revival will come from a poet named Ferdowsi, but his great work still lies ahead in the centuries to come. Meanwhile, Persian culture continues spreading across the Islamic world through trade scholarship and art. Merchants carry Persian textiles and metalwork across long caravan routes. Architects design buildings that blend Persian artistic traditions with Islamic architectural forms. Even royal courts in distant lands begin adopting Persian styles of ceremony and literature. Some scholars refer to this phenomenon as the Persianization of parts of the Islamic world. Yet historians remain careful with such labels. Cultural influence rarely moves in only one direction. Just as Persian traditions influence Islamic civilization, Islamic ideas reshape Persian society as well. The result is a rich cultural synthesis, rather than a simple replacement of one tradition with another. As evening falls over the city, lanterns glow in the windows of homes where families gather for meals. The sounds of conversation drift into the streets while scholars continue their discussions in nearby courtyards. This world feels very different from the imperial courts of ancient Persia, yet the spirit of Persian civilization still lives here. It survives through language, through poetry, through ideas passed quietly from teacher to student. And as the centuries move forward, this cultural revival will soon produce some of the most enduring works of literature and philosophy the world has ever known. Persia may now exist within the Islamic world, but its voice is beginning to rise once again. The first light of dawn spreads across a medieval Persian town where rooftops glow softly beneath the pale sky. The streets remain quiet for a moment, but inside many homes people are already awake. Bakers prepare fresh bread in clay ovens, while scholars and poets gather their manuscripts before beginning another day of study. Something subtle but important is unfolding in this world. For several centuries after the Arab conquest, Arabic dominated official writing, scholarship, and administration across the Islamic world. Yet the Persian language never truly disappeared from everyday life. It remained alive in homes, marketplaces, and local storytelling traditions. Now slowly and quietly it is returning to the center of cultural expression. A widely accepted historical fact is that by the 9th and 10th centuries, a literary form known as New Persian began flourishing across eastern parts of the Islamic world, especially under regional dynasties such as the Samanids. You imagine walking through the city of Bukhara, one of the important cultural centers of this era. The city bustles with traders arriving from Central Asia and scholars traveling between schools and libraries. Inside royal courts, poets begin composing elegant verses in Persian once again. This development carries enormous significance. For the first time since the fall of the Sassanid Empire, Persian becomes a major written language of literature, administration, and intellectual life. Yet this new form of Persian looks somewhat different from the language spoken during the time of ancient kings. One interesting detail is that New Persian adopts the Arabic writing system rather than the older scripts used during the Sassanid period. As a result, Persian literature now appears written in elegant, flowing characters originally designed for Arabic. The language itself also absorbs many Arabic words. This blending reflects the centuries of cultural interaction that followed the arrival of Islam. Instead of replacing Persian identity, the Islamic era reshapes it. You enter a quiet gathering where poets recite newly composed verses. Listeners sit attentively as the poet describes landscapes, heroes, and the passing of time with carefully chosen words. Poetry holds a unique place in Persian culture. Even today, centuries later, Persian poetry remains deeply woven into daily life. But during this period, the revival of Persian literature carries additional meaning. It reconnects the people of the region with their ancient historical memory. One figure who plays a particularly important role in this revival is the poet Ferdowsi. You imagine him working patiently for decades on an enormous project. His goal is ambitious. He wants to preserve the ancient legends and historical traditions of Persia in poetic form. The result becomes one of the greatest literary works ever produced in the Persian language. The Shahnameh, often translated as the Book of Kings, Ferdowsi spends more than 30 years composing this epic poem drawing on older oral traditions and historical records that trace the story of Persian civilization from mythological beginnings to the fall of the Sassanid Empire. The work contains around 50,000 lines of poetry. Within its pages appear legendary heroes, wise kings, tragic battles, and the moral lessons about power and justice. One lesser-known detail about Ferdowsi's project is how determined he was to preserve Persian language and identity within his writing. He intentionally minimized the use of Arabic loanwords in much of the poem, emphasizing older Persian vocabulary whenever possible. This choice gave the Shahnameh a distinctive linguistic character that helped strengthen the cultural revival of Persian literature. Yet scholars remain divided about how much the poem reflects historical reality versus mythological storytelling. Many of the characters in the Shahnameh belong more to legend than to documented history. Some researchers argue that the work functions primarily as a national epic celebrating Persian identity, rather than as a reliable historical record. Others suggest that the poem preserves valuable cultural memories even when the stories themselves contain mythical elements. Regardless of these debates, the impact of Ferdowsi's work becomes enormous. Copies of the Shahnameh spread across the Persian-speaking world. Storytellers recite its tales in markets and royal courts alike. Painters create elaborate illustrated manuscripts depicting scenes from the epic. Through this work, the memory of ancient Persia continues living within the Islamic era. As you walk through a busy marketplace, you overhear travelers discussing the famous heroes from the poem. They speak of Rostam the mighty warrior, of ancient kings who ruled with wisdom or arrogance, of battles fought long before their own time. The stories give people a sense of connection to their past, a cultural bridge linking the medieval world to the distant age of Persian empires. Historians studying this literary revival often discuss how important language can be in preserving identity across centuries of political change. Empires may rise and fall, religions may shift, but language carries memory. It allows a civilization to remember who it has been. And in medieval Persia, that memory begins speaking once again through poetry and storytelling. As evening approaches, you find yourself in a courtyard where a storyteller recites verses beneath the soft glow of lantern light. Listeners sit quietly absorbed in the ancient tales. Outside the city walls, the desert wind moves gently across the darkening landscape. And through the rhythm of poetry, the voice of Persia continues echoing across time. The sun rises gently over a medieval Persian city where the narrow streets begin filling with the quiet rhythm of daily life. You walk along a stone pathway as merchants open wooden shutters, letting morning light spill into small shops filled with pottery, fabrics, and handwritten books. This is a world where ideas travel almost as frequently as caravans. Persian cities during the medieval period gradually become places where scholars, poets, and philosophers gather to explore the deeper questions of life science and faith. The revival of Persian language and literature you witnessed earlier is now part of a larger intellectual environment spreading across the Islamic world. A widely recognized historical fact is that between the 9th and 12th centuries, cities across Persia played an important role in the broader scientific and philosophical flourishing often called the Islamic Golden Age. You step into a bustling city like Nishapur or Rayyi, where markets blend with libraries and schools. The smell of fresh bread drifts from bakeries while students hurry along narrow streets carrying manuscripts wrapped in cloth. Inside the city's learning circles, scholars debate mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. One fascinating detail about this period is how knowledge from many civilizations merges within these scholarly communities. Greek philosophical works translated into Arabic circulate alongside Indian mathematical texts and older Persian traditions of medicine and administration. The exchange of ideas creates a remarkable intellectual network. A physician may study Greek medical theory in the morning, discuss Persian herbal remedies in the afternoon, and debate philosophical questions drawn from Islamic theology by evening. You walk quietly into a gathering where several students listen carefully to a teacher explaining the structure of the human body according to classical medical texts. Nearby, another group examines astronomical charts that track the movement of stars across the night sky. Among the many scholars associated with Persian lands during this period is a remarkable figure named Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, born near the city of Bukhara around the year 980. Ibn Sina becomes one of the most influential philosophers and physicians of the medieval world. Ancient accounts describe him as a prodigy who mastered complex subjects at a very young age. By his early 20s, he was already writing books that would circulate across the Islamic world and eventually reach Europe centuries later. His most famous medical text, often translated as the Canon of Medicine, organizes centuries of medical knowledge into a systematic guide for physicians. For many generations, this work becomes a standard reference in both Middle Eastern and European medical schools. Yet scholars continue discussing how much of Ibn Sina's work represents original discoveries versus careful synthesis of earlier knowledge. Some historians emphasize his role as an organizer and interpreter of previous traditions, rather than as a completely revolutionary thinker. Even so, his influence remains undeniable. You continue wandering through the scholarly quarters of the city where debates often stretch late into the evening. Philosophers argue about the relationship between reason and faith. Mathematicians calculate complex problems using early algebraic methods. A small but intriguing historical detail involves the social spaces where these intellectual discussions occur. Many debates take place not only in formal schools but also in private homes, gardens, and small gatherings hosted by wealthy patrons who enjoy supporting scholarship and poetry. These informal salons allow ideas to move freely between disciplines. A poet might join a discussion about astronomy. A physician might contribute thoughts about philosophy. The atmosphere encourages curiosity. Yet the intellectual world of medieval Persia is not without tension. Some religious scholars worry that certain philosophical ideas borrowed from Greek sources may conflict with Islamic theology. Others believe that reason and faith can exist together, each strengthening the understanding of the other. Historians studying this era often emphasize how these debates shape the development of intellectual life across the Islamic world. Some researchers argue that Persian cities served as important centers where philosophical traditions were preserved and developed. Others caution that intellectual leadership during this period came from many regions, including Arab lands, Central Asia, and North Africa. As always, the story of cultural development is rarely confined to a single place. Still, the Persian contribution remains significant. You leave the scholarly district and walk toward the edge of the city where caravan routes stretch across the landscape. Merchants continue arriving from distant lands carrying goods and news from faraway regions. Through these trade networks, Persian cultural influence spreads widely. Poetry written in Persian appears in royal courts from Central Asia to parts of India. Architectural designs inspired by Persian styles influence buildings across the Islamic world. The language itself becomes an important literary and administrative medium in several regions far beyond the Iranian plateau. As twilight settles across the city, lamps begin glowing inside homes where families gather to share evening meals. Somewhere nearby, a poet quietly recites verses describing love, nature, and the passing of time. The intellectual life you have witnessed today reflects a civilization deeply engaged with both its past and its future. Persia is no longer an empire in the political sense, yet its cultural influence is stronger than ever. And the cities you have walked through tonight continue nurturing ideas that will travel across continents for centuries to come. But beyond these centers of learning, new storms are already gathering across the vast plains of Central Asia, and before long a force unlike anything the region has seen in generations will sweep across Persia once again. The wind moving across the plains of Central Asia feels colder now, The quiet, scholarly cities you walked through only moments ago still glow peacefully under lantern light. Yet, far beyond those calm streets, something powerful has begun moving across the steppe. You stand at the edge of a wide grassland where riders appear as small, dark figures against the horizon. Their horses move swiftly across the open terrain, their banners snapping sharply in the wind. These riders belong to a new force rising in the early 13th century, the Mongols. A widely accepted historical fact is that the Mongol Empire, led by the conqueror Genghis Khan, expanded rapidly across Eurasia during the early 1200s. Within only a few decades, Mongol armies would sweep across territories stretching from China to Eastern Europe. Persia soon lies directly in their path. At first, contact between the Mongols and the Persian world begins through trade and diplomacy. Caravan routes across Central Asia had long connected Persian cities with distant markets. Merchants carried silk, spices, metalwork, and precious stones along these roads. But relations between the Mongols and the rulers controlling Persian lands soon break down. You imagine a group of Mongol envoys arriving in a prosperous trading city along the Silk Road. Their mission is to establish peaceful commercial relations with the regional authorities. Something goes terribly wrong. According to historical accounts, the governor of the city orders the execution of several Mongol merchants and envoys suspecting them of espionage. This act triggers one of the most dramatic military responses in history. Genghis Khan decides to launch a full-scale invasion. Historians still debate whether the governor acted independently or under instructions from higher authorities. Some researchers believe the incident resulted from a tragic misunderstanding rather than deliberate policy. But whatever the truth, the consequences prove enormous. You now find yourself standing outside the walls of a Persian city as Mongol forces approach. Their armies move with extraordinary speed. Unlike traditional imperial armies dependent on long supply lines, Mongol warriors carry much of what they need with them. Their horses graze along the way, and their riders are trained to survive in harsh conditions. One fascinating detail about Mongol military organization involves their use of complex communication systems across the battlefield. Signal flags, horns, and pre-arranged maneuvers allow large numbers of riders to coordinate attacks with remarkable precision. These tactics often confuse opponents accustomed to more rigid forms of warfare. The Mongols also rely heavily on psychological strategy. Stories of their victories spread quickly across regions they plan to conquer. Cities that resist are sometimes destroyed completely, while those that surrender early may receive more lenient treatment. This pattern encourages some communities to open their gates rather than face destruction. Still, the impact of the Mongol invasion on Persia becomes devastating. You walk through the ruins of once thriving cities where marketplaces once buzzed with activity. Libraries that once housed priceless manuscripts lie damaged or abandoned. Irrigation systems carefully built over generations fall into disrepair in some regions. Population losses are severe in areas that experience prolonged fighting. Yet historians studying this period continue discussing the exact scale of the destruction. Some early historical accounts describe the Mongol invasion as almost completely catastrophic, suggesting that entire cities vanished overnight. More recent research, based on archaeological evidence, suggests a more complicated picture. While certain regions suffered dramatic devastation, other towns recovered relatively quickly or even continued functioning under Mongol administration. History often contains both tragedy and resilience. After the initial waves of conquest, the Mongols begin establishing stable rule over large parts of Persia. One branch of the Mongol ruling family forms what historians call the Ilkhanate. You enter a Persian city several decades after the conquest and notice that life has slowly begun returning to normal. Markets reopen, artisans resume their crafts, trade routes reconnect with distant lands. Interestingly, the Mongol rulers governing Persia gradually adopt many elements of Persian culture. They employ Persian administrators to help manage the complex systems of taxation and governance required for such a large territory. Persian becomes an important language within the Ilkhanate administration. Even more surprisingly, several Mongol rulers eventually convert to Islam. This cultural transformation reflects the long history of Persia, absorbing and reshaping outside influences. Another small but intriguing historical detail involves the artistic revival that begins under Mongol rule. Persian painters develop new styles that blend traditional Persian imagery with influences brought from East Asia through the Mongol Empire. These artistic exchanges produce beautiful illustrated manuscripts that remain famous even today. Scholars continue examining how these cross-cultural connections reshaped Persian art and architecture during the Mongol period. While the initial conquest brought enormous suffering, the centuries that followed also opened new channels of communication across Eurasia. The Mongol Empire created a vast network connecting China, Central Asia, Persia, and parts of Europe. Travelers, merchants, and scholars moved along these routes, carrying goods and ideas between distant civilizations. As evening settles across the Persian landscape, the memory of the Mongol invasion still lingers in the ruins of older cities. Yet nearby towns glow with a new activity. Persia has endured another great upheaval. Once again, its culture survives. And as the centuries continue moving forward, new dynasties will rise from this land determined to rebuild Persian power in yet another form. The morning air feels gentle as you walk through a Persian town that has slowly risen again after the storms of the Mongol invasion. Not long ago, these lands witnessed devastating battles and dramatic political upheaval, yet now the streets are alive with the quiet resilience of everyday life. Merchants open their shops beneath wooden awnings. Farmers guide donkeys carrying baskets of grain toward the city gates. Children run along narrow alleyways while craftsmen shape metal tools and pottery inside small workshops. History often focuses on moments of conquest, but recovery is just as important. A widely accepted historical fact is that after the initial Mongol invasions of the 13th century, Persian society gradually stabilized under the rule of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol dynasty that governed much of Iran and neighboring regions. You walk through the administrative district of a city where Persian scribes sit beside Mongol officials recording taxes and trade shipments on sheets of paper and parchment. The Mongol rulers soon realized that governing Persia requires experienced administrators. Persian bureaucrats with centuries of experience managing large empires provide exactly that expertise. One intriguing detail from this period involves the growing use of paper for official records. While earlier Persian empires relied heavily on clay tablets or parchment, the Mongol era saw an expansion in paper production which made record-keeping more efficient across large territories. The administrative offices you see around you are filled with neat stacks of documents tied with string evidence of a government gradually rebuilding its organizational structure. Meanwhile, trade begins recovering along the great routes connecting east and west. Caravans once again cross the deserts and mountain passes carrying silk spices, metalwork, and precious stones. The Mongol Empire stretching from China to the Middle East creates an enormous zone where travel becomes safer for merchants than it had been for generations. Some historians describe this period as a kind of early global network linking distant civilizations, yet scholars still discuss how stable this system truly was. While certain routes experienced increased trade, other regions remained vulnerable to banditry or political instability. Even so, Persian cities gradually regain their economic vitality. You continue a walk into a marketplace where traders speak in several languages. Persian merchants negotiate prices for silk arriving from China. Central Asian travelers sell horses bred on the open steppe. Arab traders offer spices carried from distant ports along the Indian Ocean. The cultural diversity of Persia remains one of its greatest strengths. Ideas travel alongside goods. Artists learn new techniques from distant lands. Scholars exchange knowledge brought from different intellectual traditions. One fascinating historical detail involves the influence of Chinese artistic styles during the Mongol period. Because the Mongol Empire connected Persia and China under a broader imperial framework, artistic ideas moved more easily between the two regions. Persian miniature paintings from this era sometimes show elements inspired by Chinese landscapes, clouds, and floral patterns. These artistic exchanges give Persian manuscripts a distinctive beauty that historians and art lovers still admire today. You step into a quiet workshop where painters carefully illustrate the pages of a manuscript. Tiny brushes add delicate colours to scenes depicting royal courts, gardens, and legendary heroes. The patience required for this work is remarkable. Each page may take days or even weeks to complete. Nearby scholars gather to discuss philosophy and science much as they did in earlier centuries. Despite the upheaval caused by the Mongol conquest, intellectual life gradually returns to Persian cities. Yet the Ilkhanate itself does not last forever. Like many empires built through conquest, it eventually begins to fragment as rival leaders compete for power. Historians continue debating how deeply Mongol rule transformed Persian society. Some researchers argue that the Mongol period permanently reshaped the region's political structures and economic networks. Others emphasize how strongly Persian culture absorbed and adapted to the Mongol presence, ultimately preserving many of its older traditions. Perhaps both perspectives contain truth. Persia has always shown a remarkable ability to endure political change while maintaining cultural continuity. As the sun moves higher above the city walls, you leave the marketplace and follow a road leading toward distant hills. Caravans continue their steady journeys across the landscape. Farmers work fields irrigated by canals built generations earlier. Life continues with quiet determination. But new political forces are already beginning to emerge. In the centuries ahead, powerful dynasties will once again rise from Persian lands. Some will attempt to revive the idea of a unified Persian state. Others will bring new religious and cultural transformations. The land you are walking through has survived empires, invasions, and centuries of change. And soon another powerful dynasty will appear, determined to restore Persia's political strength in a way the world has not seen for generations. The next chapter of this long story is already approaching. The wind across the Iranian plateau feels crisp as centuries continue to unfold around you. The Mongol era has passed and the lands of Persia have once again settled into a patchwork of regional rulers, trade cities, and shifting alliances. Yet beneath this fragmented political landscape, something new is beginning to take shape. You walk along a dusty road that leads toward the northwestern regions of Persia during the early 16th century. Caravan bells echo softly as traders move between cities that still remember the long legacy of Persian culture. For generations, different dynasties have governed parts of these lands, but none have fully restored the unity once achieved by the ancient Persian empires. That is about to change. A widely accepted historical fact is that in the year 1501, a young leader named Ismail I established the Safavid dynasty and proclaimed himself Shah of Iran after capturing the city of Tabriz. This moment marks the beginning of one of the most important turning points in Persian history. You imagine the atmosphere in Tabriz as Ismail enters the city with his followers. His supporters, known as the Sizilbash, wear distinctive red headgear that symbolizes their loyalty to his movement. They are not merely soldiers. They are also members of a powerful religious brotherhood that blends political ambition with spiritual devotion. Ismail himself is still very young at this time, barely more than a teenager, yet his charisma and determination attract a loyal following that spreads across much of northwestern Persia. Scholars studying this period often remark on the unusual combination of religious mysticism and military power that helped fuel the Safavid rise. Some researchers describe the Safavid movement as emerging from a Sufi religious order that gradually transformed into a political force. Others argue that the dynasty's success depended just as much on tribal alliances and regional politics as on spiritual leadership. The debate continues among historians who examine surviving chronicles from the era. Whatever the precise origins, the Safavid state expands rapidly. You walk through a newly secured city where Safavid banners hang above the gum. Markets remain busy, but there's also a sense of political transformation unfolding around you. Local governors pledge loyalty to the new Shah. Military commanders reorganize regional defenses. Administrators begin rebuilding the idea of a unified Persian kingdom. One fascinating detail about the Safavid rulers is how consciously they draw upon older Persian imperial traditions. Royal ceremonies emphasize the authority of the Shah as the central ruler of the land. Court rituals display elaborate symbolism meant to reinforce the idea of political unity across the realm. Yet the Safavids introduce something new as well, a powerful religious identity that will reshape the entire region. The Safavid rulers declare Twelver-Shiite Islam as the official religion of the state. This decision becomes one of the most important developments in the long history of Persia. At the time, most of the Islamic world follows Sunni traditions. By establishing Shi'ism as the foundation of their state, the Safavids create a distinct religious identity that separates Persia from many of its neighbors. You walk into a mosque where scholars teach the doctrines of Shiite theology to newly gathered students. Religious leaders travel across the countryside explaining these teachings to communities that had previously practiced different forms of Islam. The transformation does not happen overnight. Some regions accept the new religious framework quickly, while others take longer to adapt. Historians continued discussing how this transition unfolded across the diverse population of Persia. Some scholars emphasize the role of state power in promoting Shiite institutions. Others point to the influence of religious scholars who helped develop theological schools and networks of learning across Safavid territory. Over time, however, the religious identity of the Safavid state becomes firmly established. Persia gradually transforms into the central homeland of Shiite Islam. Meanwhile, the Safavid rulers continue strengthening their political authority. You travel to the city of Isfahan, which will soon become one of the most magnificent capitals of the early modern world. Wide avenues stretch through the city. Bridges cross gently flowing rivers. Grand squares host markets filled with merchants selling carpets, ceramics, and finely crafted metalwork. Architects design mosques with towering domes decorated in brilliant blue tiles. Isfahan becomes a symbol of Safavid ambition. One small but intriguing historical detail involves the famous phrase attributed to travelers visiting the city. They reportedly said, "Isfahan is half the world." Whether this phrase was widely used at the time or became popular later remains uncertain. Scholars still examine travel accounts to determine how contemporary visitors describe the city, but there is little doubt that Isfahan impressed those who saw it. As evening settles over the Safavid capital, lanterns reflect across the river, while scholars and merchants gather in gardens beside the water. The Safavid dynasty has succeeded in something that had not happened for centuries. Persia once again stands as a unified and powerful state, yet the empire exists within a complex geopolitical world. To the west lies the Ottoman Empire, a powerful Sunni rival. To the east rises the Mughal Empire in India. Between these great powers, Safavid Persia will soon navigate alliances, conflicts, and diplomacy. The ancient story of Persian statehood has entered a new era, and the choices made by the Safavid rulers will shape the identity of Iran for centuries to come. The morning sun reflects softly across the turquoise tiles of a Safavid mosque as you step into the growing capital of Isfahan. Wide avenues stretch before you, lined with gardens and shaded walkways where merchants, scholars, and travelers move through the city with quiet purpose. This city represents more than architectural beauty. It reflects a transformation taking place across the entire Persian world. Under the Safavid dynasty, Persia is not only rebuilding political unity, it is also redefining its religious identity in a way that will shape the region for centuries. A widely recognized historical fact is that the Safavid rulers established Twelver Shiite Islam as the official religion of their state during the early 16th century. This decision gradually transformed Persia into the central heartland of Shiite belief. To understand why this mattered so much, you walk through the courtyards of a Safavid madrasa where students gather around a teacher explaining the teachings of Shiite theology. Islam itself contains different traditions shaped by historical debates that began shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. One of the most important disagreements concerned the question of leadership. Shiite Muslims believed that the leadership of the Islamic community should remain within the family of the Prophet through a line of spiritual guides known as imams. Sunni Muslims, who formed the majority across the Islamic world, developed a different system of leadership based on elected caliphs and later political rulers. For many centuries, Persia contained a mixture of religious traditions, but the Safavid dynasty changes this balance dramatically. You walk through the city where newly built religious schools train scholars in Shiite law and theology. Clerics travel through villages teaching the doctrines associated with the 12 imams who hold special spiritual authority within Shiite belief. The process takes time. Some communities embrace the new religious framework quickly, while others continue practicing older traditions for several generations. Historians studying this transformation often discuss how both political authority and religious scholarship contributed to the spread of Shiism throughout Persia. Some researchers emphasize the active role of Safavid rulers in supporting Shiite institutions and encouraging conversion. Others suggest that the presence of learned clerics, particularly scholars, invited from regions like Lebanon and Iraq, played an important role in establishing strong intellectual foundations for Shiite theology in Persia. The discussion remains complex because historical records from the period often combine political narrative with religious interpretation. Still, the long-term result becomes unmistakable. Over the next century, Persia gradually develops a distinct religious identity that separates it from many neighboring powers. One fascinating detail about this transformation involves the rituals of mourning associated with the story of Imam Hussein, a central figure in Shiite tradition. Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, died during the Battle of Karbala in the 7th century. His death became a powerful symbol of sacrifice and resistance against injustice within Shiite belief. Under Safavid rule, public commemorations of this event become increasingly prominent. You imagine standing in a city square where mourners gather during the month of Muharram. Storytellers recount the tragic events of Karbala while listeners reflect quietly on the themes of loyalty, courage, and moral struggle embedded within the story. These ceremonies help reinforce the emotional and spiritual identity of the Safavid state. They also create a shared cultural experience that connects communities across Persia. Meanwhile, the Safavid rulers continue strengthening their political institutions. You walk through the grand square of Isfahan, known as Naksh-e-Jahan, where traders, diplomats, and travelers gather from many parts of the world. Carpets woven in nearby workshops are sold beside fine metalwork and delicate ceramics. European merchants arrive seeking silk, one of Persia's most valuable exports. Persian silk travels along trade routes stretching towards both Europe and Asia. The Safavid economy benefits greatly from this global demand. One intriguing historical detail involves the diplomatic relationships Safavid rulers occasionally established with European powers. Because both Persia and certain European states shared concerns about the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, temporary alliances sometimes developed. Envoys travelled between courts carrying gifts, letters, and proposals for cooperation. Historians still debate how effective these diplomatic efforts truly were, since geography and shifting political priorities often limited sustained collaboration. Nevertheless, these exchanges reveal how Safavid Persia participated in the broader international politics of the early modern world. As you walk through the evening streets of Isfahan, lantern light reflects off the polished surfaces of tiled mosques and stone bridges. Scholars gather in gardens discussing philosophy. Merchants count the day's earnings. Children run across the great square beneath the fading light of sunset. Persia has entered a new chapter in its long history. The Safavid dynasty has created something that will endure far beyond its own rule: a unified state, a distinct religious identity, and a cultural legacy that continues shaping the region even centuries later. Yet the Safavid world will not remain stable forever. Political rivalries, economic pressures, and military conflicts will eventually test the strength of this carefully built empire. For now, however, the city of Isfahan glows peacefully beneath the evening sky, a center of faith, culture, and power in the heart of Persia. The afternoon sun warms the stone bridges of Isfahan as you continue walking through the Safavid world. The empire founded by Shah Ismail has grown into a powerful and vibrant state. Its cities flourish with trade, art, and scholarship, while its rulers project authority across the Iranian plateau and beyond. Yet Persia does not exist in isolation. You stand at the crossroads of a region surrounded by other powerful empires, each shaping the political balance of the early modern world. To the west rises the Ottoman Empire, vast and confident, stretching across Anatolia, the Middle East, and much of southeastern Europe. To the east lies the Mughal Empire in India, another powerful state influenced by Persian culture, yet politically independent. Between these two great neighbours stands Safavid Persia. A widely accepted historical fact is that the Safavid Empire spent much of its history navigating a complex geopolitical environment between the Ottomans and the Mughals. This triangular balance of power shaped Persian diplomacy, warfare, and trade throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. You walk through a royal court where diplomats from distant lands wait patiently to present messages from their rulers. Some represent European kingdoms seeking commercial privileges. Others come from neighbouring empires negotiating alliances or border disputes. Politics in this era requires careful balance. The Safavid rulers understand that their empire sits between two enormous powers. The Ottoman Empire follows Sunni Islam, while the Safavid state promotes Shiite Islam as its official faith. This religious difference adds another layer of rivalry to an already complex political relationship. Conflicts between the two empires erupt periodically along their shared frontier. You imagine standing near the mountainous borderlands where Persian and Ottoman armies sometimes face each other across rugged terrain. Fortresses guard strategic passes, while scouts patrol winding roads that cross the mountains. These conflicts rarely produce permanent victories. Territory shifts back and forth depending on the outcome of different campaigns. Historians studying this period often emphasize how both empires recognized the limits of their power. While battles occurred, long-term domination of the region proved difficult for either side. Several peace agreements eventually helped stabilize the frontier for periods of time. One lesser-known historical detail involves the diplomatic language used in treaties between the two states. Official documents often employed elaborate titles and ceremonial phrases intended to preserve the dignity of both rulers while acknowledging the realities of political compromise. Diplomacy in many ways required as much skill as warfare. Meanwhile, relations with the Mughal Empire to the east often followed a different pattern. You travel along a caravan route heading towards Central Asia where merchants carry goods between Persian and Mughal territories. Trade between the two empires proves highly profitable. Persian textiles, carpets and metalwork find eager buyers in Mughal markets. At the same time, precious stones, spices and luxury goods from India move westward toward Persia and beyond. Cultural exchange accompanies this trade. Persian language and literary traditions become deeply influential within the Mughal court. Many Mughal administrators and scholars study Persian literature and adopt Persian styles of governance. In fact, Persian serves as the official administrative language of the Mughal Empire for many generations. This cultural connection sometimes creates an atmosphere of shared intellectual heritage despite political boundaries. You imagine visiting the Mughal court in northern India, where poets recite Persian verses beneath the arches of magnificent palaces. Yet even these relatively friendly relations occasionally encounter tension. Certain frontier regions between the two empires become sources of dispute, particularly in areas around Afghanistan where control of strategic cities carries great importance. Historians continue discussing how these diplomatic relationships influence the long-term stability of the Safavid state. Some scholars argue that Persia's position between two large empires forced its rulers to develop sophisticated diplomatic strategies. Others suggest that constant external pressure eventually contributed to internal strains within the Safavid system. Inside Persia itself, the Safavid rulers continue strengthening their cities and institutions. You walk through Isfahan's Grand Square again, where travelers from Europe, Central Asia and India mingle among merchants and craftsmen. The city has become a global crossroads. One interesting detail recorded by several European travelers involves their astonishment at the size and beauty of Safavid public spaces. Wide boulevards, elegant gardens, and monumental mosques impressed visitors who had never seen anything quite like it in their own countries. These descriptions helped spread Persia's reputation across distant lands. Yet beneath the prosperity of the Safavid era, subtle challenges begin emerging. Court rivalries sometimes divide the ruling elite. Economic pressures occasionally strain rural communities. Military reforms struggle to keep pace with changing technologies developing in Europe and neighbouring empires. Scholars still debate how serious these underlying issues truly were during the height of Safavid power. For now, however, the empire continues functioning with confidence. As the sun begins setting across the wide square of Isfahan, musicians play softly while merchants pack away their goods for the evening. Persia stands proudly between powerful neighbours, a centre of trade, faith and culture. Yet history rarely allows empires to remain unchanged forever. And the Safavid world you're walking through tonight will eventually face new challenges that test the strength of everything its rulers have built. The evening air settles gently over the grand avenues of Isfahan. Lanterns glow along the bridges crossing the Zayandeh River, and the magnificent square that once symbolised Safavid power grows quieter as merchants close their stalls for the night. The Safavid Empire has stood strong for generations, Yet even the most impressive empires eventually face moments of slow and subtle decline. You continue walking through the capital during the later years of Safavid rule, when the energy that once drove the dynasty begins gradually fading. A widely recognized historical fact is that by the late 17th century, the Safavid Empire was experiencing increasing internal weaknesses. Although the state remained large and influential, several structural problems were beginning to affect its long-term stability. At first, these changes appear almost invisible. The royal court still conducts elaborate ceremonies. Foreign merchants still arrive seeking Persian silk. Mosques and gardens continue shining beneath the bright desert sun. But beneath the surface, political authority begins weakening. One important challenge involves the Safavid system of governance itself. Earlier rulers like Shah Abbas I had worked tirelessly to centralize power and strengthen royal control over military and administrative institutions. Their leadership helped transform Persia into a unified and prosperous empire. However, later Safavid rulers often lacked the same energy and political skill. You imagine standing inside the royal palace where courtiers whisper quietly about competing factions struggling for influence. Some powerful officials attempt to guide state policy behind the scenes. Others pursue personal ambitions that sometimes conflict with the needs of the empire. Historians continue debating how much these court rivalries contributed to Safavid decline. Some researchers emphasize the role of weak leadership among later Shahs who showed less interest in governing directly. Others argue that the political structure created by earlier rulers contained built-in tensions that eventually became difficult to manage. At the same time, economic pressures begin affecting parts of the empire. Persia had long depended heavily on silk exports as one of its most valuable sources of revenue. But changes in global trade networks during the 17th century begin altering the flow of commerce across Eurasia. European maritime powers increasingly dominate sea routes connecting Asia and Europe, reducing the importance of some overland caravan networks that once benefited Persian merchants. This shift gradually affects the Safavid economy. Another lesser-known detail from this period involves difficulties in maintaining the empire's military strength. Earlier Safavid armies relied heavily on tribal cavalry forces such as the Qizilbash. Over time, maintaining loyalty and discipline among these groups becomes more complicated. Military modernization also presents challenges. European states during this period were rapidly developing new military technologies and training systems. Adapting to these changes required resources and administrative coordination that the Safavid state sometimes struggled to provide. Meanwhile, conditions along Persia's eastern frontiers grow increasingly unstable. You travel toward the eastern regions, near present-day Afghanistan, where tensions begin rising among tribal communities living under Safavid rule. In the early 18th century, one of these tribal groups launches a rebellion that eventually grows far larger than anyone at the Safavid court initially expected. The Hotak Afghans, led by a leader named Mir Mahmud Hotak, rebel forces begin moving westward toward the heart of the Safavid state. You imagine the growing anxiety spreading through Persian cities as reports arrive of advancing armies from the east. Local governors attempt to organize defenses. Royal officials debate how to respond. Yet the Safavid government, weakened by years of internal division and economic difficulty, struggles to mount an effective response. The crisis reaches its climax in 1722. Persian and Afghan forces meet near the city of Isfahan. The Safavid army suffers a devastating defeat. Soon afterward, Afghan forces surround the capital itself. Inside the once magnificent city, conditions slowly grow desperate as the siege continues. Supplies become scarce. The vibrant markets that once symbolized Safavid prosperity now stand eerily quiet. Eventually, the Safavid ruler Shah Sultan Hussein is forced to surrender the city. The empire that had unified Persia for more than 2 centuries collapses in dramatic fashion. Historians studying this moment continue discussing why the Safavid state fell so rapidly after such a long period of strength. Some scholars argue that the combination of weak leadership, economic pressure, and military decline created a fragile political system. Others believe that their Afghan uprising simply exposed deeper structural weaknesses that had developed over many decades. The exact balance between these factors remains a subject of ongoing debate. Yet one thing becomes clear as you walk through the silent streets of the fallen capital. The Safavid dynasty has come to an end, but Persia itself is far from finished. Throughout its long history, this land has repeatedly survived the collapse of powerful states. New leaders rise, new dynasties appear, and the cultural identity of Persia continues enduring through every political transformation. As the night deepens over Isfahan, the once brilliant empire fades quietly into history. But another chapter is already beginning. The quiet streets of Isfahan feel different now. The Safavid Empire has fallen, and the once proud capital that symbolized Persian unity now rests beneath the uncertain authority of new rulers. The Afghan forces who captured the city struggle to maintain control over a land that has known powerful dynasties for centuries. You walk through a marketplace where merchants speak in cautious tones about the changing political situation. The structures of empire that once organized the region have weakened, and many provinces now act with greater independence. This period becomes one of the most turbulent chapters in Persian history. A widely accepted historical fact is that after the fall of the Safavid dynasty in 1722, Persia entered a period of intense political instability marked by competing rulers, regional warlords, and shifting alliances. The Afghan occupation of Isfahan proves difficult to sustain. Local resistance movements begin appearing across the country. Persian leaders in various provinces gather forces to challenge the authority of the Afghan rulers. Among these figures emerges a remarkable military commander named Nader. You imagine him standing beside a group of loyal soldiers somewhere in northeastern Persia. Nader begins his career as a warrior within regional forces, loyal to a surviving Safavid prince. His leadership abilities quickly attract attention. Through a series of campaigns, he drives Afghan forces out of many parts of the country and gradually restores Persian control over the heartland. Historians studying Nader's rise often describe him as one of the most talented military leaders Persia produced in the early modern era. Yet scholars continue debating the extent to which his success depended on personal brilliance versus the broader desire among Persian communities to restore political stability after years of chaos. Perhaps both forces played a role. As Nader's reputation grows, his army expands rapidly. You walk through a military camp where soldiers from different regions prepare for campaigns against remaining Afghan strongholds. Drums echo across the valley while cavalry units gather beside long rows of tents. Eventually, Nader defeats the Afghan rulers who had seized the Safavid capital. With this victory, Persian authority returns to Isfahan and many surrounding provinces. But Nader does not remain simply a military commander. In 1736, he takes an extraordinary step. He declares himself Shah of Persia. This moment marks the beginning of the Afsharid dynasty. One fascinating historical detail about Nader Shah involves the astonishing scale of his later military campaigns. Determined to restore Persian power on the international stage, he launches expeditions across Central Asia and even into northern India. His most famous campaign leads his army toward the Mughal capital of Delhi in 1739. You imagine the immense Persian force marching across the plains toward one of the richest cities in the world. The Mughal Empire, once powerful, has begun experiencing its own internal difficulties. Nader's army defeats Mughal forces and enters Delhi. Ancient accounts describe the immense wealth seized during this campaign, including jewels, gold, and treasures that had accumulated in Mughal royal collections for generations. Among the most famous items taken from India is the legendary peacock throne, an object symbolizing imperial splendor. Historians continue discussing how this sudden influx of wealth influenced Persia's economy and politics during Nader's reign. Some researchers argue that the treasures helped finance further military campaigns. Others suggest that the sudden concentration of wealth also intensified internal rivalries among elites competing for influence. Despite his military success, Nader Shah's rule eventually becomes increasingly harsh. You walk through a provincial town where whispers circulate about heavy taxation and strict military discipline imposed across the empire. Many subjects begin growing uneasy under his increasingly authoritarian leadership. Scholars remain divided about how to interpret the later years of Nader's rule. Some historians view him as a brilliant strategist who revived Persian power after the Safavid collapse. Others argue that his relentless campaigns placed enormous strain on the country and ultimately undermined the stability he had worked to restore. In 1747, Nader Shah is assassinated by members of his own circle. His death once again throws Persia into political uncertainty. Several competing rulers attempt to claim authority over different regions. The empire Nader had briefly rebuilt begins fragmenting almost immediately. For ordinary people living in towns and villages these years, bring a mixture of anxiety and adaptation. Local leaders negotiate shifting alliances. Merchants adjust trade routes depending on which faction controls particular regions. Farmers continue cultivating fields that have seen centuries of political change. Historians studying this era often describe it as a transitional period when Persia struggled to find a new stable political structure after the dramatic rise and fall of Nader Shah. Eventually another dynasty will emerge from this landscape of shifting power, one that begins rebuilding the foundations of a more durable Persian state. But for now, the land rests in a moment of uncertainty. The echoes of empire remain strong, yet the future still waits to reveal its next chapter. The quiet hills of western Persia glow softly under the early morning sun. After the death of Nader Shah, the country has once again slipped into a period of fragmentation. Rival leaders control different regions, and the memory of strong centralized rule still feels distant. Yet amid this uncertainty, a new political order slowly begins forming. You walk through a modest provincial town where local chiefs gather in a courtyard discussing alliances and regional politics. Across the Iranian plateau, several families compete to establish lasting authority. Among them rises a group that will eventually shape the next major chapter of Persian history, the Qajar dynasty. A widely recognized historical fact is that the Qajar family consolidated control over Persia toward the end of the 18th century, with Aga Muhammad Khan officially establishing Qajar rule in 1796. You imagine Aga Muhammad Khan traveling across the rugged terrain of northern Persia with a determined group of followers. Unlike earlier conquerors who arrived from distant lands, the Qajars emerged from within the complex tribal networks of the region itself. Their authority grows gradually as they defeat rival factions and secure key cities. Eventually, Aga Muhammad Khan crowns himself Shah and moves to restore centralized rule over Persia. One interesting historical detail about the Qajar capital involves the city that will become the political center of the country, Tehran. At the time of the Qajar rise, Tehran is still a relatively modest settlement compared to older cities like Isfahan or Shiraz. But its location proves strategically useful. Situated near important trade routes and surrounded by natural defences provided by nearby mountains, Tehran offers a practical base for a dynasty trying to consolidate control. Over the following decades, the city grows steadily as the Qajar rulers build palaces, administrative buildings, and markets. You walk through its early streets where traders sell carpets, copper, goods, and spices brought from different regions of the country. Yet while the Qajar dynasty succeeds in restoring political unity within Persia, the world around them is beginning to change dramatically. The 19th century introduces new global forces that earlier Persian rulers never had to face. European powers are expanding their influence across Asia. Russia pushes southward from the Caucasus. Britain strengthens its presence in India and the Persian Gulf. These developments place Persia in a difficult geopolitical position. You imagine diplomats from distant empires arriving at the Qajar court carrying letters and proposals that often mask deeper strategic ambitions. Some negotiations concern trade agreements. Others involve territorial disputes along Persia's northern borders. One widely studied historical development during this period involves the series of wars between Persia and the Russian Empire in the early 19th century. These conflicts end with Persia losing significant territories in the Caucasus region. Historians often point to the treaties of Gulistan in 1813 and Turkmenchai in 1828 as turning points that reshaped Persia's northern frontiers. You picture the tense atmosphere surrounding these agreements as Persian officials attempt to negotiate terms with a powerful neighbouring empire. Scholars still discuss how these territorial losses affected Persian political thinking in the decades that followed. Some researchers argue that the defeats exposed the technological and military gap between Persia and the rapidly modernizing European states. Others emphasize how internal administrative weaknesses made it difficult for the Qajar government to respond effectively to external pressure. Either way, the experience leaves a deep impression on Persian leaders. Meanwhile, British influence grows stronger in the southern regions connected to trade routes leading toward India. You walk through a port city along the Persian Gulf where British merchants and advisors appear increasingly active. Their presence reflects the strategic importance of Persia in global politics. European powers view the country as a buffer zone between rival empires. This international competition becomes known among historians as part of the larger geopolitical struggle sometimes described as the Great Game. One fascinating detail from this period involves the way European travellers describe their experiences visiting Persia. Many write vivid accounts of royal ceremonies, bustling bazaars, and elaborate gardens that still reflect centuries of Persian cultural tradition. At the same time, they often remark on the contrast between Persia's rich cultural heritage and the political challenges facing the Qajar state. Historians continue debating how accurate these travel accounts truly were. Some researchers believe European observers sometimes exaggerated Persian decline in order to justify their own political interests in the region. Others argue that the accounts provide valuable insight into how outside powers perceived Persia during a period of global transformation. As the evening settles across Tehran, the Qajar court gathers beneath the glow of lanterns in a palace courtyard. Musicians play softly while officials discuss matters of state. Persia remains an independent kingdom, yet the pressures surrounding it are growing stronger. The next century will bring new debates about reform, modernization, and the future direction of the country. The long evolution from ancient Persia toward the modern state of Iran is entering another crucial phase, and the decisions made during the Qajar era will shape the country's path into the modern world. A pale morning light spreads across the rooftops of Tehran as the 19th century moves forward. The Qajar dynasty has restored political unity to Persia, but the world surrounding the country is changing rapidly. Industrial technologies, global trade networks, and expanding European empires are reshaping international power in ways earlier Persian rulers never faced. You walk through the capital, where government officials gather in courtyards and meeting halls to discuss the future of the country. Many of them understand that Persia must adapt. A widely accepted historical fact is that during the 19th century, Persian intellectuals, officials, and merchants began calling for reforms intended to modernize the country's political institutions, military, and economy. These debates do not happen all at once. Instead, they develop gradually as travelers, diplomats, and students encounter new ideas coming from Europe and neighboring regions. You imagine a Persian scholar returning from a journey abroad. He brings books, technical manuals, and observations about different systems of government. Inside small discussion circles, educated Persians begin talking about concepts that had rarely appeared in earlier political life. Representative government, modern education, legal reforms, industrial development. These conversations spread quietly among intellectual communities in cities such as Tehran, Tabriz, and Isfahan. One fascinating historical detail from this period involves the emergence of new printing presses that allowed newspapers and political pamphlets to circulate more widely among the population. Before this time, most written materials had to be copied by hand, which limited how quickly ideas could spread. But printed publications begin reaching merchants, students, and government officials across the country. The growing flow of information gradually changes public awareness of political issues. At the same time, dissatisfaction with aspects of Qajar rule begins appearing in several sectors of society. You walk through a crowded bazaar where merchants discuss government concessions granted to foreign companies. Some agreements give European businesses control over valuable industries such as tobacco banking or natural resources. Many Persians view these concessions with increasing frustration. Historians studying this era often emphasize how economic grievances combined with broader calls for political reform. Some researchers argue that the growing influence of foreign powers created pressure for domestic modernization. Others believe that internal corruption and administrative inefficiency within the Qajar government played an equally important role in fueling reform movements. The discussion continues among scholars examining letters, newspapers, and government records from the period. One moment that captures the rising public activism occurs during the tobacco protest of 1891. The Qajar government grants a British company control over the production and sale of tobacco across Persia. This decision quickly sparks widespread opposition. You imagine the scene unfolding across Persian cities as merchants close their shops and religious leaders speak out against the concession. Even ordinary households participate. Some accounts describe people refusing to smoke tobacco entirely in protest. The movement becomes so widespread that the Shah eventually cancels the agreement. Many historians view the tobacco protest as one of the first large-scale examples of coordinated political resistance in modern Persian history. It demonstrates the growing influence of merchants, clerics, and intellectuals working together to challenge government policy. Yet the debate about modernization continues. You enter a small school where students study new subjects such as engineering, geography, and modern science alongside traditional religious education. Educational reform becomes an important part of the broader modernization movement. Persian leaders hope that improved education will help the country strengthen its military economy and administration. Still, these changes move slowly. Some conservative factions worry that rapid reforms might weaken traditional institutions. Others argue that modernization is essential if Persia hopes to maintain independence in a world increasingly dominated by industrial powers. Historians remain divided about how deeply these early reform efforts transform Persian society. Some scholars view them as the beginning of a long intellectual awakening that eventually leads to constitutional government. Others suggest that the reforms remained limited because powerful political interests resisted significant structural change. But one thing is certain. By the early 20th century, the pressure for political reform reaches a turning point. Citizens across Persia begin demanding something unprecedented: a constitution, a representative parliament, and a government accountable to the people rather than only to the Shah. As evening falls across the streets of Tehran, groups of students, merchants, and scholars gather in private homes, discussing the future of their country. The conversations are calm but determined. Persia is no longer simply a kingdom shaped by dynasties and conquest. It's becoming a society debating its own political destiny. And the next chapter will bring one of the most important revolutions in the country's long history. The cool morning air moves through the streets of Tehran as the 20th century slowly begins. The conversations you heard among merchants, students, and scholars in the previous years have not faded away. Instead, they have grown stronger. Across Persia, people are now speaking openly about the need for political reform. A widely accepted historical fact is that in 1906, a geopolitical movement forced the Qajar monarchy to accept the creation of a constitution and a national parliament known as the Majlis. This event becomes known as the Persian Constitutional Revolution. You imagine the scene unfolding in the crowded bazaars of Tehran. Merchants close their shops in protest. Religious leaders gather followers in courtyards and mosques. Intellectuals write passionate articles in newly printed newspapers. For the first time in Persian history, large groups of citizens begin demanding limits on royal authority. Their goals are ambitious. They want laws written into a constitution. They want a parliament where representatives from different regions can debate national policies. And they want the power of the Shah balanced by institutions accountable to the people. The movement gains momentum rapidly. In August 1906, facing widespread demonstrations and pressure from influential social groups, the Qajar ruler Mozaffar al-Din Shah agrees to establish the Majlis. Persia now has a parliament. You walk through the first meeting hall where elected representatives gather to debate the future of their country. Some come from merchant communities. Others represent landowners, religious scholars, or provincial towns. The atmosphere is both hopeful and uncertain. Creating a constitutional system after centuries of royal rule is no simple task. One interesting historical detail involves the diversity of ideas circulating within the new parliament. Some reformers favour European-style political institutions with strong legal frameworks and modern administrative systems. Others believe constitutional government should remain closely connected to Islamic law and traditional religious authority. These debates shape many of the earliest discussions within the Majlis. Historians studying the constitutional revolution often emphasize how it brought together an unusually broad coalition of social groups. Merchants from the bazaars, religious leaders, intellectuals educated in modern schools, even some members of the traditional aristocracy. Yet scholars continued debating how unified this coalition truly was. While many groups supported constitutional reform, their visions for the future of Persia sometimes differed significantly. These differences soon become visible. You walk through the streets of Tehran where posters and pamphlets circulate among the population. Some celebrate the new constitutional system. Others warn that political instability might weaken the country. External pressures add another layer of difficulty. At the beginning of the 20th century, Persia remains caught between their influence of powerful foreign empires. Russia continues asserting authority in the north. Britain maintains strong interests in the south, particularly along the Persian Gulf. In 1907, the two powers sign an agreement dividing Persia into spheres of influence. You imagine the frustration this news causes among many Persian reformers who hoped the constitutional movement would strengthen the country's independence. Instead, foreign interference continues shaping internal politics. Historians still discuss how much this international pressure contributed to the instability that followed the constitutional revolution. Some researchers argue that Russian military intervention played a decisive role in weakening the new parliament. Others emphasize internal political divisions that made it difficult for the constitutional system to function smoothly. Whatever the precise causes, the years after 1906 proved turbulent. The Majlis experiences periods of closure and restoration. Political factions compete for influence. The authority of the Qajar monarchy weakens further. Meanwhile, another development begins quietly transforming Persia's importance in global politics. In 1908, oil is discovered in southwestern Persia. At first, few people fully understand the scale of this discovery, but over time it becomes clear that the underground resources of the region will soon attract enormous international attention. One fascinating detail about the early oil industry involves the rapid creation of infrastructure in remote areas. Foreign engineers and workers arrived to build drilling sites, pipelines, and refineries in regions that had previously been quiet, rural landscapes. The oil fields quickly become strategic assets. Historians often point to this moment as the beginning of Persia's transformation into a key player in the global energy economy. Yet this new wealth also introduces fresh challenges. Control over oil resources becomes a central issue in political debates. Foreign companies negotiate agreements that many Persians later view as unfair. Questions about national sovereignty, economic independence, and modernization grow increasingly urgent. As the evening settles across the capital, you walk past the Majlis building where lamps still burn in the windows. Inside, representatives continue arguing about laws reforms and the future direction of the country. Persia is no longer simply a traditional monarchy. It's becoming a nation engaged in complex political transformation, and the discovery of oil has just added a powerful new force that will shape the country's destiny throughout the 20th century. The long journey from ancient Persia toward modern Iran is accelerating. The early morning light spreads across the rooftops of Tehran as the 20th century continues unfolding. The constitutional movement you witnessed earlier has introduced new political institutions, yet the country remains unsettled. Foreign powers still influence national affairs, and many citizens feel that the promises of reform have not fully been realized. Persia stands at a crossroads. A widely accepted historical fact is that in the early 1920s, a military officer named Reza Khan rose to power and eventually established a new dynasty that would transform the country in dramatic ways. You imagine the scene in 1921 when Reza Khan, then a commander in the Persian Cossack Brigade, leads a military force into Tehran. His arrival signals a shift in political authority. The Qajar monarchy, weakened by years of instability and foreign pressure, struggles to maintain control. Reza Khan quickly becomes one of the most powerful figures in the government. Over the next several years, he consolidates influence within the army and the state administration. Eventually in 1925, the Qajar dynasty is formally replaced. Reza Khan crowns himself Reza Shah Pahlavi. A new chapter in Persian history begins. You walk through the capital during the early years of his rule and notice the atmosphere of intense transformation taking place across the country. Reza Shah believes that Persia must modernize rapidly in order to strengthen its independence and compete with other nations. His government begins launching ambitious reforms. Roads and railways are constructed to connect distant provinces. Schools expand across urban areas. The national army is reorganized and strengthened. One interesting historical detail from this period involves the Trans-Iranian Railway, an enormous infrastructure project built during the 1930s. The railway stretches across mountains, deserts, and valleys, linking the Caspian Sea in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. Engineers face enormous challenges constructing tracks across such difficult terrain, yet the project becomes a symbol of modernization and national ambition. Meanwhile, the capital city itself begins changing. You walk along newly designed avenues in Tehran where government buildings rise beside expanding neighborhoods. Modern architecture appears alongside traditional markets and mosques. Education reform becomes another major focus. New schools introduce subjects such as engineering science and modern law. Universities begin training a new generation of professionals who will help shape the country's future. Historians studying Reza Shah's rule often emphasize how dramatically he sought to centralize state authority. Local tribal leaders who once exercised significant regional power now face increasing pressure from the central government. The national army expands its presence across remote regions of the country. Administrative systems become more organized and standardized. Yet scholars remain divided about how these reforms affected different parts of society. Some researchers argue that Reza Shah's modernization policies helped strengthen the foundations of a modern nation-state. Others point out that his rule often relied on strict political control and limited tolerance for opposition. Both interpretations appear frequently in historical discussions of this era. Another important development occurs in 1935. That year, the government officially requests that foreign countries begin using the name Iran rather than Persia when referring to the nation in international diplomacy. One fascinating detail about this change is that the name Iran had long existed within the country itself. It derived from ancient terms connected to the idea of the land of the Aryans, a concept rooted in early Iranian cultural identity. However, Western countries had traditionally used the name Persia based on older Greek references to the region. The official shift toward the name Iran reflects a broader effort to emphasize national identity connected to the country's deep historical roots. You imagine diplomats adjusting their language as international documents gradually begin referring to the country by its new name. The transformation is both symbolic and political. Persia is becoming modern Iran. Meanwhile, global events begin affecting the country in unexpected ways. As the 1930s draw toward their end, tensions grow across Europe and Asia. The world edges closer to another major war. Iran's strategic location between powerful regions makes it an important area of interest for several international powers. Historians continue discussing how Reza Shah attempted to maintain neutrality while strengthening national independence during these uncertain years. Some scholars argue that his efforts reflected a desire to reduce foreign influence within Iran. Others note that balancing international pressures proved extremely difficult for a country positioned at the crossroads of global politics. As evening settles over Tehran, the city glows with electric lights illuminating streets that have changed dramatically in only a few decades. Cars now move along paved roads. Students attend modern universities. Government officials draft policies aimed at shaping a new national future. The ancient land once known as Persia has entered a modern age, and the transformation into the country we now call Iran is beginning to take clearer form. The morning light spreads across the mountains surrounding Tehran as the world enters the turbulent years of the mid-20th century. Iran has already experienced dramatic change under the rule of Reza Shah. Roads, railways and schools have begun reshaping the country, while the central government now exercises stronger authority than many earlier dynasties ever achieved. Yet events far beyond Iran's borders are about to alter the country's path once again. A widely recognized historical fact is that during the Second World War, Iran became strategically important because of its geographic position between the Soviet Union and the British-controlled territories of the Middle East and India. You imagine the atmosphere in Tehran in 1941 as global tensions intensify. European armies clash across continents and powerful nations look closely at regions that might influence the outcome of the war. Iran's location suddenly becomes extremely valuable. Supply routes connecting the Allied powers to the Soviet Union pass directly through Iranian territory. At the same time, both Britain and the Soviet Union worry about the possibility that Germany might try to extend its influence into the region. These concerns lead to a dramatic decision. In 1941, British and Soviet forces enter Iran from the south and north. The invasion moves quickly. Reza Shah, who had tried to maintain independence and neutrality, now faces overwhelming international pressure. Soon afterward, he's forced to abdicate the throne. His son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi becomes the new Shah of Iran. You walk through the capital during this uncertain transition. Foreign troops appear in several cities and political discussions grow intense as the country navigates the challenges of wartime occupation. Yet despite the presence of foreign forces, Iran's role during the war becomes crucial. One lesser-known detail involves the enormous logistical network that develops across the country during these years. Thousands of tons of supplies, including food, weapons, and vehicles, move along roads and railways across Iranian territory toward the Soviet Union, which is fighting against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. This route becomes known among historians as the Persian Corridor. Trains loaded with equipment rumble across the Trans-Iranian Railway that had been constructed only a few years earlier. Trucks travel along dusty highways carrying cargo across mountains and deserts. The infrastructure built during Reza Shah's modernization efforts now proves strategically valuable. Historians often point out this unexpected connection between domestic reform and global conflict. Yet scholars continue debating how the wartime occupation affected Iranian society. Some researchers emphasize that the Allied presence stimulated economic activity in certain regions because of increased demand for transportation and supplies. Others argue that inflation, shortages, and political uncertainty created serious hardships for many ordinary citizens. As always, the historical experience varies depending on where people lived and what roles they played during these years. Meanwhile, the younger Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi begins his reign in a complex political environment. Iranian political life during the 1940s becomes unusually active. Political parties form. Newspapers publish vigorous debates. Intellectuals discuss ideas about nationalism, democracy, and economic development. You walk through a lively cafe where students and writers exchange opinions about the country's future. Some believe Iran should strengthen its independence by reducing foreign influence over its natural resources. Others focus on expanding political participation and reforming the constitutional system established decades earlier. One issue begins attracting particular attention: oil. The discovery of oil in the early 20th century had already changed Iran's strategic importance. Now many citizens argue that the profits generated from this resource should benefit the country more directly. At the time, much of Iran's oil industry is controlled by a British company known as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Critics claim that the financial arrangements heavily favour foreign interests. Supporters of reform begin advocating for national control over the oil industry. These discussions gradually grow louder. Historians studying this era often describe it as a period of rising Iranian nationalism. Many citizens believe that their country should exercise greater authority over its own resources and economic development. Yet scholars continue debating how unified this nationalist movement truly was. Some political leaders emphasize democratic reforms, others focus primarily on economic sovereignty. Different visions for Iran's future coexist within the broader conversation. As evening settles across Tehran, the city feels alive with political discussion. Students gather around radios listening to news from around the world. Parliament members debate economic policy. Journalists prepare articles about the country's future. Iran stands at the center of global events while also wrestling with its own internal questions. And soon the issue of oil will lead to one of the most dramatic political confrontations in the country's modern history. The story of Iran's transformation is about to take another unexpected turn. The streets of Tehran feel restless as the early 1950s unfold. Political debates echo through cafes, university halls, and the busy corridors of parliament. The question that dominates nearly every conversation is simple yet powerful. Who should control Iran's oil? A widely accepted historical fact is that in 1951 the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the country's oil industry, ending the control previously held by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The leader at the center of this movement is a determined politician named Mohammad Mossadegh. You imagine him standing before members of the Majlis speaking calmly but firmly about national sovereignty. Mossadegh believes that Iran must control its own natural resources and ensure that the profits from oil production benefit the Iranian people. His message resonates widely. Merchants in the bazaars support the idea. Students gather in public squares chanting slogans about independence. Many ordinary citizens see the nationalization of oil as a symbol of reclaiming dignity after decades of foreign influence. Yet the situation quickly grows complex. Britain strongly opposes the nationalisation decision and imposes economic sanctions on Iran. Oil exports fall sharply as international companies hesitate to purchase Iranian petroleum. The economic pressure begins affecting daily life. You walk through a Tehran marketplace where merchants discuss rising prices and uncertain business conditions. Some people remain optimistic, believing the country must endure short-term hardship to secure long-term independence. Others worry that this confrontation with powerful foreign governments could bring serious consequences. Historians studying this moment often emphasize how many different political forces were active within Iran at the time. Mossadegh himself supports constitutional government and parliamentary authority. At the same time, other groups including religious leaders, nationalist organizations and left-leaning political movements pursue their own agendas within the rapidly evolving political landscape. Scholars continue debating how united these groups truly were behind Mossadegh's leadership. Some historians argue that the oil nationalization movement briefly united diverse political factions. Others suggest that underlying disagreements remained present from the beginning. Meanwhile, international tensions escalate. In 1953, a dramatic event unfolds that will shape Iran's political future for decades. You imagine the atmosphere in Tehran during those tense summer days. Crowds gather in the streets. Political rumors spread quickly. Government officials rush between offices as uncertainty fills the capital. During this period, a covert operation organized by foreign intelligence services supports efforts to remove Mossadegh from power. The plan eventually succeeds. Mossadegh is arrested. The Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly left the country during the political crisis, returns to Tehran with renewed authority. This event becomes known among historians as the 1953 coup. Yet scholars continue debating many aspects of what happened during those days. Some researchers emphasize the role of foreign intelligence agencies in supporting the coup. Others highlight internal political divisions within Iran that also contributed to Mossadegh's downfall. Declassified documents released decades later have helped clarify parts of the story, but historians still analyze how various domestic and international factors interacted during the crisis. Whatever the precise balance of influences, the outcome dramatically strengthens the Shah's position. You walk through Tehran in the years that follow and notice a growing atmosphere of centralized authority. Mohammad Reza Shah begins consolidating power more firmly within the monarchy. Political opposition becomes more limited. The government launches ambitious programs aimed at modernizing the country's economy and society. These reforms will later become known as part of a larger transformation often called the White Revolution. One interesting historical detail involves the range of policies included in these modernization efforts. Land reforms aim to redistribute farmland from large estates to rural peasants. Educational programs expand access to schools across the country. Infrastructure projects improve transportation networks connecting distant regions. Supporters of the Shah view these reforms as necessary steps toward building a modern and prosperous nation. Critics, however, express concerns about political freedoms and the speed of social change. Historians continue discussing how these reforms affected different groups within Iranian society. Some rural communities benefit from land redistribution. Urban professionals gain opportunities through expanded education. Yet other groups feel that traditional structures and cultural values are being disrupted too quickly. As evening settles across Tehran, the city lights reflect off new buildings rising beside older neighborhoods. Iran is transforming rapidly under the Shah's leadership. Economic development accelerates. Oil revenues increase. Modern industries begin expanding across the country. But beneath the surface of modernization, tensions are quietly building. Voices of criticism grow louder among certain religious leaders, intellectuals, and political activists. And within a generation, those tensions will lead to one of the most dramatic revolutions of the modern era. The evening air in Tehran carries the soft hum of a rapidly changing city. Neon lights glow above modern buildings. Cars move steadily along wide avenues. And the capital feels very different from the quieter streets you walked through earlier in the century. Iran in the 1960s and 1970s is a nation undergoing dramatic transformation. Oil revenues flow into government projects. New universities open. Expanding industries draw thousands of people from rural villages into growing urban centres. A widely recognised historical fact is that during this period the government of Mohammad Reza Shah launched a series of reforms collectively known as the White Revolution. These reforms aimed to modernise Iranian society and strengthen the country's economy. You walk through a newly built university campus where students attend lectures on engineering, medicine and economics. Many of these educational opportunities would have been unimaginable for earlier generations. Women begin participating more actively in public life as well. New laws expand access to education and employment. In cities across the country, young professionals step into careers in medicine, law and science. From one perspective, Iran appears to be moving confidently toward a modern future. Yet as you continue walking through the streets of Tehran, you begin noticing something less visible beneath the surface. Not everyone views these rapid changes in the same way. Some religious leaders worry that modernization policies are weakening traditional values and religious institutions that have long shaped Iranian society. Others criticize the growing concentration of political power around the Shah and his government. One fascinating detail about this period involves the expanding influence of television and radio within Iranian households. For the first time, millions of citizens regularly hear government speeches, international news, and cultural programs broadcast across the country. These new communication technologies help spread both support for modernization and criticism of government policies. Ideas travel faster than ever before. Meanwhile, Iran's oil industry continues generating enormous revenue. Historians often emphasize how the oil boom of the 1970s dramatically increased the government's financial resources. Large development projects reshape the country. Highways connect major cities. Industrial complexes rise along the outskirts of urban centres. Modern housing developments expand across the capital. Yet scholars continue debating how evenly these economic benefits were distributed. Some researchers argue that the wealth generated by oil fueled impressive economic growth and improved infrastructure. Others point out that rapid development also created social tensions. Urban populations grow quickly as people migrate from rural areas seeking work. Housing shortages appear in certain districts. Economic inequality becomes more visible between different parts of society. You walk through a crowded neighborhood where new apartment buildings stand beside older homes that have existed for generations. Residents gather in cafes discussing politics, religion, and the future of the country. Among the voices expressing criticism is a religious scholar named Ruhollah Khomeini. Years earlier, he had publicly criticized certain government policies and was eventually forced into exile. From abroad, his speeches and writings continue circulating among followers inside Iran. Historians studying this period often discuss how networks of religious institutions helped spread political messages across the country. Mosques function not only as places of worship, but also as centers of community discussion. Religious gatherings provide spaces where people can share concerns about political authority and cultural change. Scholars remain divided about how influential these networks initially were. Some historians suggest that opposition movements remained relatively small during the early years. Others argue that dissatisfaction was growing quietly beneath the surface long before it became visible in large public demonstrations. Meanwhile, government security institutions monitor political activity closely. Opposition groups sometimes face arrest or censorship. Supporters of the Shah believe that maintaining strong authority is necessary to preserve stability and continue modernization. Critics argue that limiting political freedoms prevents meaningful dialogue about the country's future. These tensions gradually intensify. You imagine standing in a university courtyard during the late 1970s where students gather in small groups discussing political philosophy and social justice. Across the city, workers hold meetings about economic conditions. Religious leaders deliver sermons addressing moral and political questions. The atmosphere feels increasingly restless. By 1978, protests begin spreading across multiple cities. Demonstrations grow larger. New participants join from different sectors of society, including students, merchants, clerics, and industrial workers. Historians continue debating exactly how these diverse groups formed such a powerful coalition. Some researchers emphasize shared frustration with political repression. Others highlight economic concerns or cultural resistance to rapid Western-style modernization. In reality, the movement includes many different motivations. As night falls over Tehran, the streets feel charged with anticipation. Something significant is approaching. The political system that has guided Iran for decades is about to face a challenge unlike any it has encountered before. And within a year, the entire structure of government will change in ways few people standing here tonight could fully imagine. The winter air in Tehran feels tense as the year 1979 approaches. The protests that began spreading across Iran during the previous year have grown larger and more determined. Demonstrations fill city streets, university campuses, and marketplaces. What began as scattered unrest has turned into a nationwide movement. A widely recognized historical fact is that the Iranian Revolution of 1979 brought an end to the monarchy of Mohammad Reza Shah and replaced it with a new political system centered on an Islamic republic. You stand among a crowd gathered in one of Tehran's wide public squares. People from many different backgrounds are present. Students carry banners calling for political change. Merchants from the bazaars close their shops in solidarity with protest movements. Religious leaders address crowds gathered outside mosques. The atmosphere feels both hopeful and uncertain. For decades, the Shah had ruled as one of the most powerful figures in the country. Now the authority of the monarchy appears to be weakening rapidly. During the final months of 1978, demonstrations expand across major cities including Tehran, Tabriz and Isfahan. Government attempts to restore order sometimes lead to violent confrontations between security forces and protesters. News of these clashes spreads quickly, increasing public anger and drawing even more participants into the movement. Historians studying the Iranian Revolution often emphasize how unusually broad the opposition coalition became during this period. Secular intellectuals who supported democratic reform, religious leaders calling for Islamic governance, students demanding political freedom, workers protesting economic inequality. Many groups that previously disagreed about the country's future now unite around a common demand: the end of the Shah's rule. Yet scholars continue debating how this coalition formed so rapidly. Some researchers argue that long-standing dissatisfaction with political repression created the conditions for mass mobilization. Others emphasize the importance of religious networks that helped coordinate protests across different cities. Still others point to the symbolic power of exiled leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, whose speeches circulated widely on recorded tapes and printed pamphlets. These recordings travelled quietly through mosques, universities and private homes. They allowed messages from exile to reach millions of listeners. By early January 1979, the situation reaches a critical moment. The Shah leaves Iran. You imagine the quiet uncertainty filling the capital as news spreads that the monarch has departed. Some people celebrate in the streets. Others watch cautiously, unsure what will happen next. Soon afterward, Ayatollah Khomeini returns to Iran after years of exile. Crowds gather in enormous numbers to welcome him. The political system that had governed Iran for decades begins transforming almost immediately. Within months, a national referendum is held asking citizens to choose the country's future political structure. The result leads to the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. One fascinating historical detail about this period involves the drafting of a new constitution that blends elements of republican government with religious authority. The system includes elected institutions such as a president and parliament. At the same time, a powerful religious leadership structure known as the Office of the Supreme Leader becomes central to the state. Historians continue discussing how this political framework reflects both revolutionary ideals and long-standing religious traditions within Iranian society. Some scholars argue that the constitution represents a unique experiment combining democratic mechanisms with religious governance. Others emphasize the tensions that can arise between these different forms of authority. Yet for many citizens in 1979, the revolution represents a powerful moment of transformation. You walk through the streets of Tehran during those early months after the monarchy's collapse. Posters and banners decorate walls. Political debates fill public spaces. New institutions begin taking shape as leaders attempt to define the direction of the new republic. But the revolution also introduces new challenges. The country must rebuild its political system while navigating international tensions and internal disagreements about the future. Different factions within the revolutionary movement continued debating how Iran should balance religion, governance, and modern society. Scholars studying this era often note how quickly events unfolded. Within only a short period of time, a monarchy that had ruled for generations disappeared. A new political system emerged in its place, and the identity of the country, once known as Persia, had entered another stage of its long historical evolution. As the evening settles across Tehran, the city remains alive with conversation about what the revolution means. The ancient civilization that once built vast empires has now transformed itself into a modern republic shaped by both history and faith. But the deeper story of Persia's influence does not end with the revolution. It continues shaping the Iran of today. The night air over Tehran feels calm now as the long journey through history begins to slow. The revolution you just witnessed transformed the political structure of the country. Yet the deeper story of Persia did not begin in 1979, and it certainly did not end there. Instead, the events of the modern era represent only the latest chapter in a civilization that has been evolving for more than 2,500 years. You stand quietly on the hill overlooking the city as lights stretch across the valley below. Tehran, with its crowded streets and modern skyline, might seem very far removed from the ancient capitals of Persepolis or Isfahan, and yet the threads of history still connect them. A widely accepted historical fact is that modern Iran carries within it layers of cultural heritage, stretching back to the earliest Persian empires. Languages, traditions, architecture, and political ideas developed across centuries continue influencing the country's identity today. You can see these connections everywhere, in the Persian language still spoken by millions, in the poetry of Ferdowsi and Hafez that people continue reciting in homes and gardens, in the architectural styles that blend ancient design with Islamic artistic traditions. Even the very name Iran reflects a long historical memory rooted in the ancient idea of the land of the Iranian peoples. As you reflect on the journey you have taken tonight, the long arc of Persian history begins to feel clearer. The story began with small tribal kingdoms scattered across the Iranian plateau. Then came the rise of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great, creating one of the largest political systems the ancient world had ever seen. That empire fell to Alexander the Great, yet Persian culture endured. New dynasties rose. The Parthians and the Sassanids rebuilt Persian power and rivaled Rome for centuries. Then came the arrival of Islam, transforming religion and politics across the region, while Persian culture adapted and flourished within the broader Islamic world. Scholars continue discussing how remarkable this cultural resilience truly was. Some historians argue that Persia's ability to absorb outside influences while preserving its identity represents one of the most enduring characteristics of Iranian civilization. Others emphasize that each historical transformation reshaped Persian identity in ways that make it impossible to speak of a single unchanging culture across thousands of years. Both perspectives offer valuable insight. The Safavid dynasty later re-established a unified Persian state and introduced the Shiite identity that still defines modern Iran. The Qajar era brought encounters with European power and early debates about modernization. The 20th century introduced oil nationalism and the complex politics that eventually produced the Iranian Revolution. Through every transformation, the civilization of Persia adapted to new realities. One fascinating detail often noted by historians involves how Persian cultural influence spread far beyond the borders of modern Iran. Persian language and literature shaped the courts of Central Asia and Mughal India. Persian art and architecture influenced designs across the Islamic world. Even today, many cultural traditions across a vast region carry echoes of Persian heritage. Yet scholars remain careful not to treat Persian history as a simple story of continuous influence. Civilizations constantly borrow from one another. Ideas travel across trade routes through migration and through centuries of intellectual exchange. Persia both shaped and was shaped by the many cultures it encountered. As the city lights shimmer below you, the long sweep of time feels almost peaceful. The empires that once ruled these lands have disappeared. The armies that marched across deserts and mountains are long gone, but the deeper rhythm of Persian civilization continues. Families gather in homes, sharing stories. Poetry is recited beneath quiet garden trees. Students study history in classrooms not far from the ancient ruins of older worlds. And the identity of Iran continues evolving in ways that future generations will interpret in their own time. Now the wind grows softer, the city grows quieter, and the long story you have followed tonight slowly fades into the calm stillness of night. You breathe in the cool air and imagine the ancient plateau stretching far beyond the horizon. Somewhere out there lie the ruins of Persepolis, the gardens of Isfahan, the caravan roads that once carried merchants across continents. Their stories still whisper through the landscape, and as sleep begins to approach, the long journey of Persia gently settles into silence. For now, let the history drift away like distant footsteps across the desert sand. Let the voices of ancient kings, poets, and travellers fade into the quiet of the night. The story has travelled from empire to republic, from Persia to modern Iran, across thousands of years of human experience. And tonight you have walked through it all. End of script, sweet dreams.